Good morning and welcome to today's Corporate Governance and Audit Committee meeting. I'm Councillor John Taylor and I chair this committee. I'd like to start just to remind members and officers and visitors today to use their mics when they're speaking so that we will capture what you're saying. And I'd also like, just before we start, to welcome some new members. So we have Councillor Harry McCarthy who's joined us as a new member. And we also have one of our independent members, and Andy with us as well, Andy North. Our other independent member, new independent member, Nick Booth, unfortunately couldn't make this meeting, but will be joining us at the next meeting and subsequent meetings. I'd also like to take this opportunity right at the beginning to thank Chris. So Chris Jones is retiring as a co-optee today. So this is his last meeting with us. And I'd like to just put on record my thanks for the valuable insights and input he's provided to this committee over the last two and a bit years. So yeah, but to move formally onto the agenda. So the first item on the agenda is membership of the committee. So I believe we have one member. So I think we have one member who's...
Thank you, Chair. I'm substituting for Councillor Holmwood.
Thank you. I think I should perhaps now just ask the members of the committee to introduce themselves. So I'll start with Councillor Safdar.
Councillor Imran Safdar, Crossland Moor and Netherton Ward.
Councillor Cathbennett from Cleckheaton.
Chris Jones, independent member. Andy North, independent member.
Councillor Harry McCarthy, Colne Valley Ward.
Councillor Angela Sewell, Gurkha Ward.
Councillor Caroline Holt, Liversidge and Gomersall Ward.
Thank you, members. Officers, when you first speak, if I could ask you to introduce yourselves as well. Thank you. So, agenda item 2, minutes. Oh, apologies for absence. So, we've just had apologies from Councillor Holmwood, and we've also had apologies from Councillor Armour as well. And from Nick, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, our independent member. Okay. Agenda item 2, minutes of the previous meeting. Are members of the committee content with the minutes? Yep. Okay, thank you. I'll move on to agenda item 3, which is declaration of interests. Just remind members that if they do have an interest, they should declare it. You can declare it now, or if it comes up during the meeting and you realise you have got an interest, please mention it at that point in time. If you do declare an interest, if you could fill in the form online and provide that to Nicola at the end of the meeting or after the meeting. Thank you very much. Admission of the public. This is a public meeting. Members of the public are welcome. Obviously, it's being screened as well. There is a private item at the end of the agenda, and when we get to that point, we will end the public session. But at the moment, it is a public meeting. Deputation and petitions.
None received, Chair.
And then public questions.
None received, Chair.
Okay, so we're straight into item 7, which is the annual report on Treasury Management. I think, James, you're going to introduce that, aren't you? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm James Anderson, the Head of Accountancy for the Council. And yes, this is the Treasury Outturn Report. So, basically, there's 3 Treasury reports that we bring to committee, a 6-monthly report, an outturn and a strategy. This is the annual report that goes with the outturn, describing and highlighting the activity for the year. So, start by saying the Council operated within the strategy approved by members and Council in March 2024, which keeps cash levels at around 30 million in secured liquid investments in order to manage day-to-day cash flows. And also to note, there was an underspend of 0.8 million against the Treasury budget of 27.9 million. So then I'll just go through the various component parts. So we start with investments. Investments averaged 64.5 million and earned an average interest rate of 4.86%. The majority of investments are placed in instant access deposit accounts, such as money market funds, and the DMO, the Debt Management Office, which is part of HM Treasury, so very secure investments. The council has 10 million fixed investment in the CCLA property fund, which is held for a number of years now, and that returned a gross dividend yield of 4.4%. High bank rates were obviously good for investment returns, as short-dated cash rates were high. So we've got sort of inflated investment returns on the income side. Just to note that short-term rates peaked at 5.19% at the start of the year and dropped to around 4.45% at year end. Money market rates were also fell between a range of 5.27% at the start and 4.42% at the end of the year. There's then an economic context which is provided by our Treasury advisors, Arlene Close, which I won't comment on. And then in terms of borrowing, the cost of both long and short-term borrowing has remained high throughout the year. Many central banks have started to reduce their policy rates. However, gilt yields have been more volatile and have increased overall during the period. So our borrowing rates are higher than we experienced last year. PWLB rates obviously follow those yield rates, and they've been very volatile throughout the year. So borrowing was taken when opportunities arose and gilt yields dropped. So we're actively managing the borrowing within an agreed set of parameters. So in terms of borrowing activity, the total external borrowing has increased overall by 66.7 million to 774 million. And that's described in tables 1 and 2. Just to note, the council's repaid 40.1 million of long-term loans during the year and had 41 million of temporary borrowing at year end. The weighted average borrowing rate in 24-25 for all loans was 4.26%. And the council has taken out 98 million of new long-term borrowing from PWLB in the year 24-25. We now have a portfolio of short and long-term borrowing, and that was maintained throughout the period in line with the strategy set in March. It probably came to committee in January. Capital financing then, the CFR is a capital financing requirement, and that's the underlying need to fund capital expenditure via borrowing. So the council has seen an increase in CFR due to the capital programme and consequently an increase in borrowing requirement on the back of that. We highlight a CFR that's increasing compared to current borrowing and highlight the borrowing required to fill that gap. So in the chart, the gap between the dark grey and the liability benchmark is the shortfall in funds. There's also just a point that we use cash flow forecasts to underpin borrowing decisions, which avoids unnecessary borrowing, which can lead to cost of carry and other investment risks. The council will continue in line with strategy to take a mixture of long and short-term borrowing when opportunities in rates arise in consultation with Arlene Close, our Treasury advisors. That's a brief rundown of the report, so ready to invite questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I'll open it to members. Members have any questions? Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. I was just looking at the future. Much of the report's about the past, and in Appendix 5 it looks as though the CFR requirement is going to go from 849.7 million in this year to 1.171 billion by 2027. So it's a question really of whether the Treasury management function's set up to deal with that expansion, about 300 million over the next few years, whether you've got any concerns that perhaps we need to reflect in the executive summary on that.
So, yeah, good point, and well noted. It's, the CFR is based on the capital plan that we have in place, so some of it will be around delivery of that plan. So we'll take some of those historical analyses in of delivery against plan when we sort of look at our borrowing. But again, we're not limited by PWLB borrowing, so we can apply for that as and when. And really, the check on that really is internally. So we obviously have to bear in mind that any borrowing reflects into a revenue cost for the interest. And and so we're limited. Probably we have to factor in all those borrowing requirements into Treasury budgets. So that's in some ways a limiting factor. But in terms of actually borrowing, that isn't so much an issue. But again, we look at daily cash flows and plan those out for a year ahead. So we are actively looking and can plan when we need to borrow. And obviously then within that, every decision we take, if we know borrowings required in the near future, we'll start having conversations with Treasury advisors around when the ideal time might be, and they, even down to the morning or the afternoon session, when they can sort of predict which one of those will be better. So in terms of access to funds, not an issue, but you're right, the key issue there really is the revenue effects of that capital budget, which we do take into account.
Do you want to come back on that, Andy?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, it's just really, it worried me when I looked at it, I suppose, from a public perspective. So it's just whether it might be worth putting people's minds at rest a little bit up front in the report rather than leaving the numbers into Appendix 5. That was my observation.
Thank you. Kath?
Clearly, the counts. What I always worry about the Treasury Management report is that we view it in isolation from the rest of what the council's finances are set up to do. So, in this report, the questions for me are not that we are within prudential borrowing requirements, because we are, but whether or not it is prudent for the council to borrow that much money and for a capital plan, which then requires long-term financing, which has an impact on the revenue side of the council's finances, and hence the amount of revenue that's available for day-to-day services. Now that's the problem for me, is that we see this in isolation. And so looking at it in isolation, you say, yeah, everything, we're ticking the boxes here in terms of prudential borrowing, all that, and for the capital plan. However, councils across the country are finding themselves in difficulty because of the scale of their borrowing, capital borrowing. None of us here want that to happen to this council, because it has dramatic and drastic effects on public services. So the question for me, I don't know whether James is in a position to answer it. Probably not, because it's the wider question of, okay, but what is the impact? And we've got some of the figures about the impact in terms of interest rates, MRP, and all the rest of it, and the long-term effect, which, as I have said before, we're pushing back the cost of this borrowing, large parts of it, 10, 20 years away, when it will be very significant. And it's bad enough now, be much worse 10, 20 years' time. So who is making that sort of judgment is the question on this scale of borrowing, because it's not here, and I'm just asking the questions.
Thanks, Kath. I think that links to the budget, really, and I just wonder whether Graham wanted to come in and address that, perhaps, because it is about the ambitions of the administration, isn't it, really, rather than James in terms of the technical.
Yeah, and you're quite right, John. It's a budget process, and it was in last year's budget, previous year's budget. We always borrow money. All local authorities, you rightly point out, borrow money. And when the worst of austerity hit, we went through in great detail our level of borrowings at the time and compared ourselves to our comparator councils. And we had a graph, if you like, as you always do in finance, and we were a little bit to what I would call to the left of that, where our borrowing was a little bit higher as a percentage-wise of our revenue budget than many other local authorities. Not dangerously so, but a little bit more. So at that point, the then Section 151 officer, myself, decided to bring that down, so we're probably in line with the average borrowing costs. And I can't remember what the figure is now, but I think we're probably still in that ballpark still. So as a percentage of our revenue budget, our borrowing is pretty much in line with most of the comparative councils of a similar nature as to ourselves. There will always have to be borrowing, because as you appreciate, some projects cost a lot of money, take a lot of time to deliver, but I've always been comfortable with every Section 151 officer I've worked with. We talk this through. Can we afford this? Yes, because capital, I have to remind people, because they don't always understand this, capital always becomes revenue. It always reverts to revenue at some point. So we balance that judgment up of, this is what we want to borrow, this is what the impact will have on the revenue budget. So we take that decision and it goes through the budget process.
Did you want to come back, Kath, or are you happy?
The only thing I would say is it'd be wise for us all to read the external audit report.
Chris, you indicated you want to come in.
Yes, I suppose there's two aspects. And one, I get complete assurance, I think, from the reports we get quite regularly about Treasury Management over the effectiveness of the way Treasury Management is operated in the council. It seems to be very rational and logical, the way borrowings are managed and investments are managed. So that's all to the good. I do think, as I look at that future stuff, as Andy's said, there's got to be a question mark over the affordability of £1.1 billion worth of debt. Other things being equal, who knows what council finances will look like over the next few years, and maybe things won't be equal. But it's not just then about the cost of borrowing, it's about the return, financial and other, on those investments that are underpinned by that. And that's not a topic, I think, for this committee, other than I think it would be useful for the committee, I've said this before, to have greater input into the kind of processes by which budgets are set and are agreed, because it's, as a kind of financial system, it seems to be a core one. It's not something that features on the audit plan, and I think probably it should, as a control point of view, not for this committee to say whether the budget's right or wrong, but just that the processes seem to be effective. I can't, it seemed to me we could have a report on that that's similar to the Treasury Management report, really. It's just a financial system.
Just on that, Chris, as well, our scrutiny function do have the ability to request details in private of the individual business cases associated with some of these capital projects. And that's where we should be scrutinising and getting that assurance that, that there is a return. I mean, I share everybody's concerns around the scale of the plan, growth in the plan over a relatively short period at a time when interest rates and yields are quite fluid and hedging upwards, certainly in gilts. And I do worry if that continues, not only does it have an impact on the affordability of it, but it also may eventually, because the government is borrowing significantly at the moment, eventually you may get to a stage where you are starting to find that funds aren't as easily available as perhaps we might hope they would be. So there is a concern there. I do know that both the peer review and our external auditors have picked up about, and it's completely accepted and recognised by the administration, that we need to improve our project management delivery and management of capital projects and the capital plan, because it does continually shift, and that's a piece of work I think they are looking at. I don't know, is that something you could comment on, Graham? I don't know whether it's really your remit or not, in terms of what we're doing about contract and project management, or whether it's something Rachel might want to comment on.
Probably more Rachel, because more on procurement.
I think she's getting ready to speak.
Hi, my name's Rachel Spencer-Henschel, Deputy Chief Executive. I've actually covered that in part of my presentation at item 4 in terms of financial culture. So if it's okay with you, Chair, shall we wait and take questions on what I give an update on?
Members, do we have any more questions on James's report? We're asked to note that report. Are we content with noting the report? I'm seeing nodding, so yeah, thank you, James. Thank you very much. I'm going to move swiftly on to agenda item 8, which is our update on district heating. I think, Janet, are you presenting this?
So, good morning. So you have received as a committee a number of times an update on the district heating programme, and particularly with relation to the management of district heating across our council estate, and also the matters that we had found ourselves in a couple of years ago with regard to the metering and billing. And that coincided with an internal audit report in June 2024, which the committee came to the committee, and also there has been a number of reports from the Homes and Neighbourhood Service to provide an update following that audit. So I came to committee a couple of months ago where I provided an update, and there were further questions around the June 2024 audit recommendations, and the committee, I feel rightly felt that they hadn't had a full response to some of those audit recommendations. So following that meeting, a considerable amount of work has taken place, and with colleagues across the council, to be able to go back to the start and review the district heating, review the historical information, and also the audit actions and recommendations, and also to provide more detail about how we as a service are responding to the audit recommendations. So hopefully, I would like to discuss today is around, a more detailed report that picks up obviously on the district heating. It picks up the audit recommendations. It picks up how we have responded to those recommendations. It also provides additional information in terms of what we are introducing now in terms of robustness of management of our district heating schemes, and also an update on the action plan that responds to the recommendations. So I won't go through all of the report, but hopefully it provides a little bit more clarity in terms of what we mean by a district heating scheme, and also the difference between district heating and a community heating scheme. Which is where you would have a boiler maybe within the buildings themselves. It also identifies some of the learning from this process, so how many properties we have got linked to district heating, and also provides, I hope, a fuller response to the audit recommendations, and also the recommendations that we have completed in terms of the actions and the changes we would put in place, and also provides a little bit more information of the work we are doing, and there is a small number of those recommendations that we are still working through, and they will form part of the future council audit report that comes forward through to this committee and through council governance on a regular basis. The other thing that included in this report, working with colleagues, is obviously an update of where we are in terms of the financial implications, because I know that was incredibly important for the committee when I came last time, in terms about how we are managing our contract with Switch 2, making sure that, we have found ourselves in a difficult situation where bills hadn't been increased for many, many years. And then obviously the increase in costs for many of our tenants and leaseholders has obviously been significant, and the impact of that. So we don't find ourselves in that situation for where we're seeing a jump in prices. And also how we have dealt with the losses. I think, as this previously been reported, is that the council took a pragmatic decision on how we dealt with those losses on the district heating account, within the housing revenue account, and also provides more information in terms of how those tariffs have changed. There was questions as well at the last meeting around the rules around, you know, how we can move to a full cost recovery, which is what we need to do with regarding heating bills going forward, and also what the rules and Ofgem rules are regarding, you know, how far you can go back and recover costs, and that I've now included that within the report. And also provides information around our contract with Switch 2 and the services they provide. That is going to be re-procured. There has been a variation of contract for a number of years now with Switch 2, and it's prudent that the council carries out a new procurement of that contract, and also one that aligns with, obviously, the new Procurement Act. And also it is timely. But what is also timely is that within Homes and Neighbourhood Services is we put in place more robust contract management of any future contract arrangements, and also much more in-depth analysis in terms of how people are using their heating in our district heating schemes, accuracy of bills, and also intervening and supporting any vulnerable households at a much earlier stage. Further in the report, there was a number of questions around any schemes that have solar panels, solar PV, and also where the council is on its decarbonisation strategy for its council housing stock. So I've included some of that information in the report. And in section 3.5, updated, obviously, the risk and the impact assessment within the report, as well as closing off some of the audit actions that we have completed, and also making sure that the lessons learned from this process is being used to inform and make sure within Homes and Neighbourhood Services, working closely with our colleagues in financial services, is that we have much more robust management of all incomes, transparency of costs where we're placing costs to our customers, and particularly our tenants and leaseholders, and making sure we've got robust management in place for the recovery of those incomes. And both this audit has been really valuable, and also there's now been a considerable amount of work, plenty of lessons learned from this process, and that is going to strengthen the service, and it will strengthen how we manage our debts moving forward. I wasn't really going to go through all of the detail of the report, but I'm happy to pick up any questions, and I've also got colleague Jackie Fieldhouse from Finance as well, and we will answer any questions that the committee may have. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Janet. I'll open it to members.
Thanks, Janet. It's very good to see the substantial progress that uni team have made. I remember my first meeting when we discussed this, and it felt a long way from where we are now, so that's great. Just a couple of questions. Firstly, where are we with the procurement? It says in the report that we're going to procure someone by the end of December, so I guess we're well on with that and have got something in place. Secondly, I'd like to know a bit more about the communal boiler schemes. That wasn't part of the scope, but is there a risk they're running at a deficit as well? And thirdly, if I may, the report makes reference to the housing revenue account shouldn't subsidise leaseholders, I paraphrase. Are we sure that it hasn't subsidised them historically, and is there something to do in terms of tidying up the accounting around that historically?
They're doing, and they are doing a considerable amount of work for us at presently. They're looking at the efficiency of our boilers, they're looking how they perform, and they look what we want for a new contract. So we are well on with that process, and we are now in that stage of obviously moving forward on the procurement process so that we have a contract in place by the end of the year. And that will obviously follow the council's governance process. I think in terms of the charges to leaseholders, things like that, One of the things that report is clear is we need to move to full cost recovery, both for our tenants and leaseholders, but we need to be much more transparent in terms of the breakdown of costs and what we're expecting, and also where we are doing major works, what that entails, and also so that can, obviously, people can be assured that we have got. We, as part of the process, one of the things that we have done is done quite a lot of work, both with, Switch 2 and obviously colleagues, to actually making sure that the tariff that was introduced in January is reflective of what we need to charge. But we also, I think, as included in the report, it's only fair that we only go back so far with that, and you can see that in the guidance from Ofgem. So I'm satisfied that going forwards, we have got the mechanism now in place to set the right tariff, so we're not going to end up with customers with a spike in costs, and they can be assured. And also the robustness of process. During the year, there is that monitoring and management of those, so we can actually see both in terms of usage and the cost of running our district heating schemes. So I think I feel satisfied that, that process is in place. And also one of the recommendations in the report is we're introducing, obviously, a dedicated district heating manager. And that, because I think that's what it needs, somebody who's got their hands on, the oversight of this, this intensive management. And also you will see from the report, we need to be doing much more work to be looking at what is our decarbonisation strategy for council housing stock, and this is a key component of that.
Chris?
I kind of agree with that, and it's all good. I'm just not sure I got the answer to my specific questions, whether historically the housing revenue account's been charged with losses for leaseholders, and it shouldn't have been. I mean, because in your report it said that shouldn't happen, so it's a historic question more than a going forward question. And I don't know whether it matters, others colleagues will know, but it seems to me, and I did ask that question when the report first came, are we illegally subsidising through the housing revenue account when we shouldn't be? And I think it just needs tidying up, and so it's a yes or no answer at some point. It doesn't have to be today.
I think it is, it is legitimate charge to housing revenue account. I think where we have leaseholders, the council owns the freehold of those buildings, and anything that could not be charged, it is we have had this checked that it is legitimate for us to pay. What we don't want to be is in this situation again. We need to draw a line under this. We don't need to be in this situation again. There is about drawing a line under this, moving forward. But we need to make sure that we are not subsidising either our tenants or our leaseholders. But we are supporting any household through the council's many areas where it will support our most vulnerable customers, whether they be leaseholders, whether they be private residents, whether they be tenants, through the arrangements, the partnership arrangements that we have in Kirklees to support the most vulnerable who are facing serious hardship. And so that's where having somebody who's dedicated on our district heating, who can and will be actually not only making sure we are performing our responsibilities on the contract management of the contract, but are also looking at where people are facing it in arrears, where people are facing serious hardship, and actually what else is happening in those properties and what more can we understand. We also need to understand is where people are not using heat. And that's really important, and that's obviously a key part of our future asset management strategy here in Kirklees that will be brought forward to Cabinet for approval at some stage as a refresh during the next couple of years.
Okay. Councillor Cooper's indicated he wants to speak as well, but I'm just going to bring in members of the committee first, that's all right. Andy.
Thank you, Chair. No, it's just a more general question, really. I mean, obviously, this internal audit's identified some control issues originally around direct heating. So the question was really whether there's other revenue loss or whether we need assurances in other areas. Perhaps the internal audit that was originally done was broader in its scope than just direct heating, but I'm new to the committee, so I'm not familiar with that. I'm not sure how I answer that question, if I'm honest.
and we'll talk about internal audit later on in the meeting, but we do try and prioritise areas where there is potential risk and losses. And part of the reason why we uncovered this problem was because the internal audit team went in to look again at an area which previously they'd looked at and hadn't been entirely satisfied. And rather trying to avoid re-debating what we've debated in previous meetings on this, it became very, very clear that there was more of a problem here than perhaps had been anticipated. And that's the value of internal audit, really, as well, and the value of this committee. But we do have to be continually mindful of, particularly when we are looking at audit plans, looking forward, about are there some areas perhaps that we aren't looking at that could potentially be at risk. I think the best way I'd probably answer that one, Andy.
Yeah, briefly. First of all, it's demonstrated the value of this audit committee, number one. Number two, with thanks to Janet for taking this on, and in actually quite short period of time resolving, nearly getting to the end of it, because that will have not been easy. The third thing is just with all these issues, it's not just the problem with the actual problem that was being solved. It's the consequences of, debt write-off that's going to have to happen, the consequences of lack of income or lower income into the housing revenue account, which has a knock-on effect to all the other tenants. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, perhaps we ought to do some more deep dives into some of these areas of the council, because if tenants' rents or council taxpayers or whatever, which are funding services, are not being spent well, then it's our job to root it out where we can. And so I'm hoping we can do another deep dive in a potential area that's a problem, to help the service get it right, because that's our role.
I'll ask you to save that thought for later on the agenda when we talk about the audit plan as well. Come back to it. Yeah. I'm going to bring Harry in next.
Thanks, Chair. So, sorry, I wasn't here when this was discussed at the last committee meeting, but am I right in understanding this relates to a staff handover, and then there wasn't the knowledge wasn't passed on, or is that not correct?
I think this goes back many years, I think, and actually not giving it the focus, and one of the things that, is where there has been, a number of staff changes, but I wouldn't blame that on this. The service has to take responsibility for managing all of its contracts, and also we possibly didn't give it the focus that it needed, unlike, other income, obviously debt management that is taking place by Homes and Neighbourhoods. And that's one of the lessons learned in terms of what we're putting in place to make sure that we are not in this situation again, and we're much more open and transparent.
Yeah, thank you. And then just again for information, was this raised by the auditor again in, was it 2019? And then it wasn't picked up until 2024?
I believe that was the case, yes.
I think it's not quite that. They did identify that they were making a loss. They produced a report, took it to the management team, had a list of actions, but then didn't actually follow through. But there's a danger here, Harry, and I'm going to stop you at this point. There's a danger of us reopening a debate we've already had at previous meetings. I'm happy to chat to you about it afterwards, and perhaps fill you in a little bit rather than, elongate it here.
If I could confirm, so each and every financial year, the council reports on all of its accounts that it manages. It manages many you know, ring-fenced account similar to the housing revenue account. There is a robust performance management in place as part of council governance for both its income and also expenditure, as being obviously set out previously at this committee, but also through the recent report today on treasury management. So there's a very strong, I think the focus was that it was reported, you know, it was reported as an issue through council governance. But I think as a service, we probably could have been a little bit more proactive about some of the improvements we needed to bring forward to address at that time. However, a lot of work has tried to do to try and getting underneath the information, actually looking at that, you know, doing that analysis, and also taking, managing the contracts that we had to make sure that, you know, we were providing accurate and timely information to our tenants and leaseholders. And I think that's one of the lessons from this, you know, but the council does have a robust performance management for all of its debts and all of its income within the council, and you would expect us to do that, and that formal process that's provided obviously by Treasury Management.
I'm going to bring Andrew in. So under CPR 36.1, members of the council who aren't members of the committee are entitled to speak, and you're entitled to speak for up to 5 minutes, should you so wish.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the report, Janet. I remember when Switch 2 took over the contract in 2013, and it was a move from flow meters, which measured the flow of water, to heat meters, because sometimes you'd have the flow of water with not necessarily the delivery of heat. So progress is slow, but we're getting there. And I don't want to revisit at this stage, it's not been the council's finest hour with regard to what happened with all the money, and I'll not go into that now here. But there's certainly are a few questions reading the report that I thought are worth bringing up. You're looking at decarbonisation and how we can get better decarbonisation in our district heating schemes. One thing I didn't see mentioned in the report was the district heating that we're looking at from the energy from waste plant, and whether that could be incorporated into the scheme, because ultimately that can reduce our capital costs, provide us more delivery of heat, particularly in the Huddersfield area. And so we're looking at Spring Wood, we're looking at Hill House, we're looking at near the town centre. So those sort of areas, I think I'd like to sort of see that at least it's being considered, and how we can do that to reduce future capital costs and hopefully revenue costs for the people as well. That was one thought. Another is looking at the tariffs. You look at the tariffs, and 7.3 pence tariffs to 13.7 pence per unit at the top, nearly double. In Perseverance Street, which is in Newsham Ward, which I represent. And so it seems that when you look at that, you think we are an energy provider which charges different rates according to where you live. And you're more likely to be in fuel poverty in one area than in another, managed by us, with things that are under our control. And so I look at this and I think, was there an opportunity missed here to actually look at the harmonising of tariffs and seeing if we approach it in that way? I understand the reasons for the tariffs. I understand that you know, where you've got smaller schemes that costs are higher. Perseverance Street, I think it's about 8 properties that are actually on that scheme. You look at Aitlands, those sort of places in Dewsbury, well over 100. So I understand the reasons, but actually is it right that we offer different tariffs? Final point really is about opting out, and looking if we've done everything we can to stop the opting out from district heating schemes. Because when people are given the opportunity to opt out and set up their own boilers, not only do they increase their own maintenance costs, their own capital replacement costs for boilers, they reduce the viability of the whole system for people on that network. And so if we let people opt out, that means that the costs for using that system will increase over time. In a new heat network system, in a new build area, we would be able to stop that happening, certainly. And I'd like to see if we, in legal terms, whether we can actually stop people doing that. Because it's not in their interests, and it's not in the wider community interests for them to do that. So should we really give them the option to do the wrong thing for them and for the council?
Thank you. So in terms of the report, obviously talks about the Homes and Neighbourhoods asset management strategy for its council housing. The council has have a strategy clear around climate change and decarbonisation. So I think, welcome obviously your feedback. So one of the things that we are doing is we are carrying out some work, and as it's included in the report, we have a contract. We are doing a huge amount of work looking at how we can improve the quality of our council homes as part of its asset management strategy. And part of that is the decarbonisation, and that will fit in what is the right thing to do for our council homes moving forward, if that is affordable. And that will obviously, that work once concluded, that will go through obviously the council's governance, it will go through portfolio holder, and ultimately some decisions will be taken through its cabinet meeting. But there is a much larger sort of climate change commitment here in Kirklees, it's strategy. And so welcome the feedback, and I'm sure that's absolutely embedded in what the Kirklees wants to see across its borough in moving forward. And that I'm sure obviously that is the subject of many discussions at its cabinet meeting. But I can take that back obviously with the relevant portfolio, but we will feed into that overarching strategy. In terms of the tariffs, I think one of the things that I think one of the challenges is that we need to make sure that we have got different boilers with different performance and different efficiencies. And that's why we brought in Chirp Heating to have a look, because we're also looking at refreshing the 30-year asset management plan for our council housing. And that really needs to prioritise, obviously those boilers and those boiler plants, to make sure that they are maximum efficiency, and also that future plan for their replacement as part of the 30-year asset management strategy. And again, there'll be lots of priorities for improving council homes, and obviously that will be subject to formal council governance and approval at that point. We've also got to be mindful that, as we are passing on costs for boilers, for meters, to leaseholders in line with their own individual leases, is that we have to be open and transparent about what those are costing. There's got to be an open and transparency of information. And one of the things the council does want to do is align its future capital investment programme with the efficiency of boilers, so that everyone living in a district heating network has got those efficient boilers and systems in place, and their ultimately bills will reduce, including if there's any government and external funding available, again, that can go to those schemes that can offset some of those costs. In terms of the opting out, I completely agree. I think here in Kirklees, but across the country, there are loads. There must be millions of historic leases. But certainly I absolutely agree that to protect the viability of these schemes, then opting out, is difficult to manage for a number of reasons. One, around how the system works, as you will know. The other thing is that we need to make sure that all of our buildings are safe. And if we have too many properties that are opting out of schemes and using other form of heating, and if we're not sure what that other form of heating is, that can pose a danger not only to that household, but to everybody else who's living in those properties. So there is a number of reasons why, you know, reducing any sort of opting out, and here, you know, there's been a huge amount of work to avoid opting out and working with people to stop that opting out. But we've also got to be mindful that there are individual leases, and we've got to make sure that we work within those leases, you know, in terms of what we can and can't do. But for any new leases, we do have the opportunity to actually be really, really clear on some of these areas. Thank you.
One quick point. The thing I said at the beginning about the energy from waste plan, we're looking at as a council doing something about, you know, in terms of getting a heat main, which can do a lot of public buildings, you know, but maybe the leisure centre right next door to Springwood housing. I'd just like a note really from somebody about just showing that that's being considered and covered, and so that's part of the discussion really about future capital options for boiler, instead of just simply boiler replacement, putting them on a heat main.
Thank you. I think I've noted that lie down, and I'll certainly obviously have those discussions, obviously, particularly with David Shepherd, obviously as Executive Director, obviously the new Director for Homes and Neighbourhoods, and also bring it to the attention of our portfolio holder, Councillor Crook. Thank you.
Thank you. Do members have any more questions? Caroline?
Just two. You did say that one of the recommendations is to appoint somebody whose specific role it is to oversee all this. Has that actually gone further than just looking for funds?
No, we've updated a job description for this, so it's very, very specific of the skills and the competences that we need for this particular role. So we've done that. We're working closely with our colleagues in HR to look at how we recruit that role. We're also been doing some working with other local authorities to see how they are recruiting similar roles. We're hopeful that job will go out this month, and we're hopefully with quick turnaround that we will be able to have somebody in place as soon as possible. In the meantime, we are using some of our existing resources to fill that gap whilst we get somebody, but having somebody with the skills and experience in this is really important, I think, moving forward.
And the other question was how much or how many queries, or what's been the impact of contacting the residents when you put all the, has it been a positive? Has a lot of people complained? Has it caused any hardship, or don't you really know yet?
I think it's early to tell, but I think some of the feedback from the teams is that, you know, we have had obviously a number of queries, and it's identified two things. I think we've had a positive feedback about that transparency and certain things that will happen, and a reassurance moving forward. We've had some obviously communications concerned about not just cost for district heating, but wider vulnerability. And so that's enabled us to be able to, you know, we've got a new obviously vulnerable persons policy, but it's been enabled us to work closely with housing management colleagues in terms of how we might triage support for those families. And I think there's just been an acknowledgement, I think, from some that, you know, they feel more confident that actually, you know, won't be in that position again, and obviously we'll have transparency of bills moving forward. And we've had some that have said, you know, they really can see more detail behind some of those numbers and things, and a better understanding. And we've had quite a number that have said, are you applying for all the grants that you can to be able to improve the network?
So it's opened up dialogue.
So
then.
I think, you know, certainly that is something that, you know, in the coming months we will be talking closely with our portfolio holder, and also as part of the refresh of the housing revenue account for 26-27, and I expect that this and some of the options to improve council housing will be a key part of that HRA business plan report that comes through to Cabinet.
Happy? I did have a couple of questions, but I thought I'd wait. And literally on some of the audit actions, 4, 7, 9 and 11, they all state that we have a target date of the 30th of June. We're now on the 20th of June. So I'm just asking, are we still confident that they'll all be closed in the next 10 days?
Yes, so on recommendation 4, rightly cut out, that's 30th of June. And there, I think that work is in an advanced stage, and that is coming forward for approval by that date. So we are confident with that. The recruitment confirmed previously. Obviously, we're well on with that.
So I think the recruitment one...
7.
No, sorry, Janet. The recruitment one clearly we're not on target for, because it says recruitment is underway to appoint a dedicated manager, estimated target date 30th of June. Well, we're not going to have a manager in place by the 30th of June, are we? You've already explained that. I understand the reasons, and, you know, progress is being made, but that date's wrong, isn't it?
Well, recruitment is underway.
Yeah, but it says recruitment's underway to appoint.
Yes, it's underway to appoint, and we will be appointing a manager, but it depends, you know, if we find the right person to appoint.
Okay.
But yes, you know, it could take, you know, it could be a quick process, and it could do, but certainly one of the things I felt that, you know, recruitment has started.
Right.
Right. But you're absolutely right, you know, that it may take some time to get a person in place.
Well, it's not going to happen by the 30th of June.
No,
You know that.
no.
So to say we've got an estimated target date
No.
30th of June,
Yes.
probably we need to re-look again at what our target date is for that. But recommendation 7.
Right, so on recommendation 7, we have a meeting today with Chair Heating around the report, looking at obviously the efficiencies and the work that we've asked them to undertake, and that will be going forward through to a formal meeting, so I'm confident that we will have the finalised report by the 30th of June.
Okay. And then there was 9 and 11 as well.
I think that's part of the same report with Joe Heating.
Right, so I'm confident that they'll be done.
Yes, and there's a meeting today to go through their findings and to look at anything further we need in that report so it can be finalised by the end of the month.
Thank you. That's it from me, Janet. Thank you.
Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Could you put it on slideshow, Matt, for me, just so that it's more visible? Chair, and thank you, committee, for allowing me to come and do this presentation today. If you can just go to the first slide for me. So what I've got for you today is, following a number of conversations I think this committee has had over the past year or so, and obviously my conversations with the Chair, we've been asked repeatedly, particularly in light of the conversation we've just had about district heating, how are we taking those individual issues that the Audit Committee have helped to uncover and using those to make sure that we don't make the mistakes again by having a bit more of a council-wide approach to a better financial culture. So what I'm going to take you through today is we've asked our 151 officer, who joined the council, for those who don't know, last May. So he's been here a year and he's managed to sort of make a financial assessment from his perspective of what he thinks the culture is across the organisations from an officer perspective. We've also put in a few issues that were identified by the external auditor that weren't included in Kevin's assessment, but as you would expect, there's a lot of similarities from what he's seen that obviously external audit colleagues have seen, as have you as a committee. We've got a bit of a culture refresh programme at the moment called Our Council, which is a way of trying to engage staff to think differently, and I'll take you through some of the principles of that. We've also got a few transformation programmes. We've got many transformation programmes across the organisation, but we have got a few focused on financial culture, so I'll just give you a bit of an overview of that. And then I'm really, really keen to get your views as the Audit Committee on things that I might not have got here, but that you've seen over your work as the Audit Committee over the past year or so. So I hope that's all right with everyone. I'm not quite sure how much time I've got, Chair, so shall I... I'll crack on. Yes, okay. So if you can just take us to the slide after that, please. So in Kevin's view, he thinks these are the following things that are going well. We have got ownership and collective understanding now of the financial position of the council. We've got improved budget monitoring and reporting through executive leadership team and into cabinet. So for those of you who see the stuff that comes to cabinet, you know, we're RAG rating, we're taking it down to quite micro levels so that we've got transparency in that information that's going public. We have regular check and challenge meetings within each directorate, which essentially says, are you delivering on your savings? Are you staying within your budgets? Is your performance suffering as a result, or are we maintaining good performance levels, and what level of risk are you running for the organisation, so that we can really be on the front foot and understand where we are with either savings delivery or dealing with in-year pressures. We've got an improved budget setting process, which, as you know, this year put more money into frontline services so that we don't keep having a massive overspend at Q1, which has been the case in the last couple of years. We've got a people panel process now, which essentially means that senior leadership teams go through business cases for recruitment, and that goes into a central process, which is looked at from the capacity of, do they have the budget? Is it externally funded? Have we got staff that are at risk of deployment that we could move into that? So we've got a really tight process now that makes recruitment more managed so that it doesn't cause us a problem from a financial perspective. But crucially, we also make sure those posts that we know we struggle to recruit to can go through without too much bureaucracy. We've got spend controls in place, and obviously we do quarterly monitoring in terms of making sure people aren't spending unnecessarily through things like purchase cards, and people that use cash, which is predominantly in children's centres for younger people from some of our looked after children, but we still need to monitor all of that. We've committed to transformation, and so there is a transformation reserve in the budget that was approved this year, as well as some capital funding for transformation opportunities, because obviously we need to change to be more efficient. And Kevin would say, not to be unstated, the council accounts continue to have an unqualified audit opinion, which, as you all are aware, is quite unusual. So next slide, please. So in terms of the budget issues then, so lack of a budget book has been cited by a lot of council members in the chamber, but I think the impact of that is that it's really difficult for members to see what services actually cost so that they can understand where they would want to make choices for targeting savings. So we've committed through working with the cross-party budget group to have a budget book in place by July, so that's on track. We've had historic budget pressures which have not been reflected in future budgets. So if you think about those areas where we've repeatedly overspent every year, we should have just put budget provision in the base budget rather than drawing on reserves each year. So in the 25-26 budget, we put about 50 million in to deal with those kind of historic budget pressures. And you can see that in the appendices of the budget report to be as transparent as possible. Obviously, demand pressures will always be greater than we can predict, but I think this was more about those areas that it happened every year. We knew it happened every year, so why don't make a provision for it so that actually the true overspends are more about demand. And I think probably not all budget holders had felt involved previously around the budget process. So did they feel a bit like they were done to rather than take that ownership? Because often you find that people manage their budgets more effectively when they understand and they're part of that. So we've greater involvement of budget holders now in setting the budget, and we've got finance managers producing budget packs for every manager so that it's a lot clearer and we've got that relationship. Next slide, please. I think this committee will know we have used reserves historically to balance the budget at the end of the year. And so the 25-26 budget, we've used 5.5. We're proposing to use 5.5, which obviously is a reduction from 13 million in the previous year. And Kevin's ambition is to not use reserves at all in the subsequent years. Obviously, all savings with the best will in the world often have a slippage for reasons usually outside of people's control. Some of that is probably about better planning. So, for example, if you're going to do a service change that reduces your staff, you need to build in how many weeks it takes to do your union consultation. So if you've only put your saving to be a full year effect when we know it won't be achieved, that's an obvious thing that we need to get staff to be a lot clearer on. But what we've also done to mitigate some of that is to put a bit of a one-off reserve in, so that if there are any of those things that happen that isn't in our control, whether that be about decision making, etc., then we've got that mitigation in place. We had an issue where some of our staffing budgets don't always reflect some of our SAP structures. So we use SAP as our management system, which, for those of you who are aware, there's no perfect system. So what we've been trying to do is lead a piece of work to make sure everybody's absolutely clear what's on their structure and and that aligns with the budget that they've got. Because sometimes you can have people leave posts, the posts don't get removed off the system, and people think there's budget there that isn't, or vice versa. So we've got a exercise going on to do that, and we'll use the people panel process to make sure we've got that oversight of releasing of posts, so that it's not something that directorates can do in isolation, because that's where you get a lot of risk. Next slide, please. In terms of in-year overspends, without any plans to mitigate that, obviously that's often dealt with reserves, which doesn't help. Some of that is about getting a consistent approach to fees and charges, which I'll come on to in one of the other recommendations. How are we making sure that we've got a conversation about whether we stop doing something? So how do we look at that as a way to make sure we're not having a significant overspend? But how do we do that whilst understanding the impact for people in Kirklees? So how do we make sure that we're not taking a decision that has an impact on residents without that going through the proper process and scrutiny? One-year budgeting, you'll all know, doesn't help in terms of trying to get an effective financial culture. So we're hoping that we will get a 3-year funding, but we'll certainly be looking to set our MTFS in September on a 3-year basis so that we can have that longer-term approach. Next slide. So income from fees and charges, we've had historic inconsistencies about how fees and charges are looked at. And some of that is that some services haven't increased them where they ought to have, but in some cases it's been increased higher. And so how do we get a more consistent approach to that? So what we've tried to do is keep it at 3% year on year, and that was agreed in the budget this year. But obviously, if there is something that is outside of that, so say, for example, the cost of food has gone up by 10%, then we might make an exception for some of those fees and charges that have got those market forces in play. But ideally, for those regular ones, it will be a 3% increase year on year, which takes away that kind of service choice element and moves into a much better position of being able to predict the budget going forward. We've had an inconsistency across the council in charging overheads to revenue grants. So obviously, if we get a grant to do a particular thing, it's not unreasonable to top slice some of that for the administration of doing that scheme. But I think there's been inconsistencies about how we've been doing that. So we've got an external funding officer who's been working with managers on how to get external funding through grants and others, but also how to properly budget for it. So you're not just budgeting for the activity, you're budgeting for the cost of administering that activity as well. Next slide. So on to the capital plan, which obviously is quite prudent considering our conversation we had about Treasury management earlier. So I think with the Treasury management report, that's based on the existing capital plan. One of the things that Kevin wants to do is a really full review of the capital plan in line with the MTFS by September. And that's because we need to understand the affordability, understand the benchmarking, baselining that capital, and really understand what the priorities of the organisation is. Because I think you will know from looking at the budget reports, we've set quite an ambitious plan and we often don't achieve it. And actually, we need to be a lot more realistic about this, because when you're looking at some of those figures around the debt cost, if it's not going to transpire that that is the debt cost, then we shouldn't have that in our plan. That said, I think capital reviews are, I mean, it is a live process, really. We never sit still when it comes to capital review, but this particular piece of work to inform the MTFS is about saying we want to be much more realistic about what we know we can deliver in year, and we all need to understand the implications of the debt for that. That leads on to the fact that I think not all services can quite understand the link between capital and revenue when we're borrowing. So how do we make sure that when people are putting business cases in for capital, they understand that they need to be responsible for paying the revenue costs, so that actually we put the onus back onto services rather than that be something that's dealt with corporately. And then capital plan reporting, I think it's outside of kind of the portfolio holder and cabinet in private. I think what goes to public cabinet on capital plan reporting is probably too high level. So we're committed to do enhanced reporting so we get a bit more detail in Q1 this year. So hopefully you'll see that coming through. And then lastly, last slide, governance. Interestingly, that we've just done a bit of a review of governance arrangements around capital, because it's really, really challenging because capital projects often take so long, so many years, that you find that things happen that relate to a decision that was made, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. So what we're trying to do is get more exposure and ownership of that capital governance arrangement so that we can streamline the boards that we've got, because there's quite a lot of them, and make sure that we've got the right reporting and governance mechanisms in place so there's no surprises with that. Okay. Move on, thank you. So obviously quite a lot of the issues I've identified there, or Kevin's identified, you're very aware of, and obviously the external auditor is, but there is a couple of others on the next slide that I think is just to add that were obviously part of our VFM report this year. So contract management, how do we improve contract management and ensure consistency of good practice? We've got a transformation programme looking at that, working with Sam's team to make sure that we can put a bit of resource behind that, because we know that obviously some of it's very effective, but it's not consistent, and that's what we need, consistency. We're also doing quite a lot of training on the new Procurement Act, so obviously that will help people, because we do have to, through the Act, we have to publish the performance of our contracts. So that's a new thing, and actually that will really help us to get people to feel a bit more on top of their contract management. And then I think lastly, benchmarking, you know, it was flagged by external audit that we needed to do better benchmarking. And I think having the budget book will be really helpful with that, because what you often find when you look at the savings proposal is that's often a very small percentage of the overall council budget. So how can you as members be assured that the benchmarking is clear enough so that you understand whether we're getting good outcomes and value for money for some of our services? So we've got a piece of work going on so that that will go alongside the budget book so we can do that proper benchmarking. Okay, so what are we doing to address this? Next slide for me. So we've just recently, you may have seen the logo around, we've just recently launched a programme called Our Council, and that's kind of taken over from what was called We Are or Where Kirklees, depending on your accent. And part of that is that we know from what our staff have said through the peer review that they were ready for a change of direction or a little bit of an invigoration of the culture of the organisation. So whilst it might feel a little, I don't know, about logos rather than substance, what we know through things like behaviour change and how people work in different cultures is you need something to hang some of this stuff on. So what we've got is 7 key principles, and the 2 I wanted to draw your attention to today was living within our means. So how do we get a more finance-focused culture so that employees understand that money we spend is public money, that council doesn't spend more than it has, services understand their budgets and have the right skills, they've got a good understanding of current and future pressures on budgets and how we can predict what's going to happen. So we know our population, we know what the predictions are. How can we translate that into knowing what our costs are? And then how do we get the basics right, which is obviously is in our council plan as one of the priorities, but how do we make sure that we're holding managers and staff to account for where they're not getting those basics right? So that's about linking through our performance management framework for staff and appraisals, but also how do we do some focused work with different managers at different levels to say, you know, these are the principles, we will help you put them into practice so that we are in a better position financially. Next slide. So transformation programs, we've got quite a lot of transformation programs. So for those of you that are on other committees or have seen stuff, we've got one on adult social care, we've got one on special educational needs, but what we've also been trying to do is focus on how we can address the financial culture by putting a bit of resource and support into some of these. So we've got 2, we've got council debt recovery and internal recharging. Next slide, Matt. So debt recovery is about how we can make sure that people understand where they are incurring debt. So we've got a new dashboard which will help directorates be really clear about what debt they've currently got and how they manage that and put those principles of debt recovery in place. Because as you can imagine, for every resident, they could have multiple debts with us, for whether that be rent arrears, whether that be council tax. How do we get that one single picture of a person? And to a certain extent, there's no point in chasing multiple different departments chasing debt for an individual who isn't going to be able to afford to pay it. So how do we try and make it more person-centred rather than just chasing debt from service to service? And then we're looking at income management, which is about how do we do payment at point of sale? So rather than saying, we'll give you a thing and you've got 30 days to pay it, in which case sometimes people don't pay it because they've already had the thing. How do we say, well, actually, if you want a thing, you need to pay us and then we'll give you that thing. So it's a very simple example, but it's actually quite significant when you look at both the cash flow during that 30-day period and the lack of recovery in some cases. And then how do we use electronic payment more? Because we know that that's more effective in terms of making sure we don't have any debt and we keep that income coming in. Next slide. Please don't worry about seeing the detail of this. This was just illustrative. So this is the sundry debt report, which will now go to every service area, and it'll just give them a real understanding of what real-time debt they're managing. So we were obviously trained managers on how to interpret it because it took me a while. But what it's trying to do is get that ownership from within those budget holders. Next slide. Internal recharging. So in some cases, there is always internal recharging in a business like ours. You can't not have it in certain, particularly when it relates to capital projects, particularly where it relates to things like the housing revenue account. But I think there's been historically some internal recharging, which is just about playing shopkeeper between departments. So let's say a really good example is, let's say I want to put on an event and I need a road closure. Do the highways department charge my budget to close the road? It seems pointless to do that when really what you should have is we're all one council and we're all going to put on this event and the budgets reflect that. So part of that is about removing income targets that don't really have any value because it's not external income. And some of it's just about a bit of a culture shift because people have worked in that way for a long time and it's how you get people out of that. So we've removed some already in 25-26 and the service directors have agreed to remove where practical. So unless it's grants, capital or HRA, then our ambition is to remove all those. And then we make sure we centralise those budgets that are all over the place and don't really make any sense in terms of almost feeding that culture of internal recharging. Okay, next, and then next again for me. So I hope that was okay. I'm sorry if I took up more time than I should, but hopefully some of that resonated with what you've seen in this audit committee. And I guess I'm just interested to know if there's anything that you think I've missed there that we can feed into this programme of work. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll open it to members. Any questions or comments? All right, Chris.
Obviously, there's an awful lot going on, which is good. I get nervous about the phrase transformation because sometimes you just need to improve things a bit and get a big return. So I got bored being transformed, but perhaps that's language you use here. Absolutely agree with the comment about the clean audit opinion. Of course, for the last 3 years, the Council's had a red report on value for money, particularly about medium-term financial strategy. And I guess, if anything, this cultural shift is designed to contribute to addressing that. So I was disappointed that wasn't reflected in the report, in your presentation. I think it's really important. So there's lots of practical things. I came away a bit unsure about what cultural shift we're trying to achieve. So I suppose I have no evidence of this, but if I put myself in a position of being a middle manager in a large organisation that continually overspends its budget every year and dives into reserves to plug that up, I wonder if I'd be highly focused on managing my budget or if I'd be more focused on doing good things for my service users or even looking after my staff. And I think it's that, getting that cultural balance right is the thing that I think you're trying to achieve. And I didn't quite get from that presentation how that was going to work. Because there's not, most organisations that historically overspend, that just becomes the norm, doesn't it? And whilst I get there's been some areas of significant demand that cause that overspend, I think last year pretty much every area of the council apart from corporate services overspent. And corporate services didn't overspend because that's where you do all the financial jiggery-pokery, which is fine. So it's more endemic, isn't it, than it's demand-led, and it's more endemic than it's 2 or 3 key service areas. So I think you're doing all the right things, but it is urgent to get that cultural shift, and I'm not sure all those processy things around recharges will change the culture, if I'm honest.
Just to respond to that, I think one of the real challenges with the council-wide is that it's never one size fits all. So your middle manager comment is absolutely legitimate, but it might be that, I don't know, a middle manager who is, I don't know, a social care team leader, what we expect from them in understanding their budget might be very different from, I don't know, the manager of communications service, because actually, as you say, it's a real balance. What have we employed that manager for? Is it about the social care understanding to keep our children safe, or is it about budget management? So I think there will be a different answer depending on what your business is, because it is so disparate. So I take your point entirely, and perhaps what I can do is use more illustrations, because it will be different in different bits of the organisation. But from a corporate services perspective, what I want to be able to do is, if Service X needs more support from finance, HR, etc., because they don't have those skills, then we should be able to put that in. It shouldn't be a consistent approach across the organisation. And you're right about the VFM red rating, to point that out. Yes, apologies, that's my...
Just one follow-up. I kind of get that, but I suppose my starting point is that if we set the budgets correctly in the first place, then the ask of managers is the same, which is to deliver the service within the budget. So that comes back to the work that's been done this year to boost budgets at the start of the year. Must mean it's a kind of no excuses year this year, that there can be no overspends wherever you sit in the organisation.
Just before Catherine, I think Graham was indicating he wanted to say something.
Yeah, and the problem, one of the problems we have is we are a demand-led organisation, and whilst we do our absolute best to predict over the budget period what demand may be, if, say, 3 families moved in and we had to take 6 kids into care, that blows that budget. So we always have to react to demand. We must deliver, because people have a statutory rights on the services that we provide, and it's a morally and right thing to do, but it can blow the budget. And we do put a lot of effort in trying to predict, but it doesn't take a lot in some of these services to push them over the edge a little bit, because some of these children or adults may come with a huge bill, and we make that, we're going to look after them, of course we are, but it can blow the budget. Certain areas, it is much more predictable that you're not looking at a demand-led service, you are doing a project, so nobody's going to come knocking on your door every week saying, I need these children in care, or these children need an SND package, and all those sort of things. So, yes, you're right, some areas must control their overspend, but we must accept that there are areas where that overspend is actually beyond our control, because we have to make sure those people are looked after. We have to protect those vulnerable children and those adults, so sometimes it's a bit tricky.
Right, thanks, Graham. Kath, you wanted to come in?
Yes, unfortunately, I've got quite a lot to say. I won't say it all, actually, because there's too much. So, the first bit is, over my years on the council, the council has swayed from central control to, no, services and managers in services can best place to control their budgets. And now we seem to be moving back to a halfway point, almost, between central control, services manage their budget, to somewhere in between where there's some strong oversight from the centre. When you talked about managing vacancies, for instance, and staffing. So I'm not supporting either approach, but you do need an approach that everybody understands in the council and fulfills what they have to do. So with a halfway approach, I don't know. It may be more difficult to get that message across. So that's sort of a question, really. I agree about transformation. Again, I don't know how many times when I've been a member of this council that we have been transformed, and whether or not any of it has actually ended up well, I don't know. Third thing I want to say is I have been so frustrated to the point of anger about the lack of a budget book. You know, we as a council, councillors, not the cabinet, as councillors have a responsibility to understand how the council is raising money and spending it. And it is impossible to do that without a detailed budget book. Now, maybe it's only me and half a dozen others who want to see it, but actually we should see it, because we would then have been able to address value for money a bit better than we have. And so I don't know why it was stopped about 5 years ago, something like that it was, but I will be delighted if we have a big budget book, 300 pages of it, so I can go through and understand where the council's spending its money, and where, you know, is it spending it well. You know what I think about the capital plan. You've raised that. Capital plan should not be a wish list, because that's, I think, where we've got to as a council. We would love to transform Huddersfield. So would I. But actually, if you can't afford to do it, scale it back a bit or phase it over, you know, a longer period. But having a huge capital borrowing requirement, which has to be funded from revenue, and then not being able to spend the money, is the worst of all worlds, actually. Because you're not achieving the investment, you're costing service users the revenue that could be spent, and nothing changes. So having a really tight capital plan would be a huge improvement. So I've got 2 more points I'm going to make. I chair a Yorkshire Waters charity that helps people pay their water bills. And one of the things we have to identify is, what are the other debts they have? Council tax is always the biggest. And what that tells me is a combination of, and people who are desperate, I mean, I'm not talking about people who won't pay, that the council tax support scheme is inadequate, and that there are not identified ways to help people pay some of their council tax. So I don't know whether any of that is legal, whether we're legitimately allowed to do things like the Yorkshire Water Resolve scheme, where you pay half and they get the rest wiped off, or whatever. So I don't know, but council tax now is a huge bill. You know, a couple of thousand a year is a lot of money for people. So I don't know. It'd be worth knowing if any of that is possible. The last thing I want to say is we may have a 3-year funding review, funding agreed with government, but we also know we've got cuts coming. Because although core spending is going up 3.4%, was it? That is based on council tax being raised by 5%. So there's a 1.6% or something like that cut in our spending over the next few years. So, which is going to make all this even more challenging. I'll leave it there.
I think both Rachel and Graham want to come in, so it's up to you two to decide who comes in first.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up a couple of things. Capital plan, you've mentioned that several times. I can assure that Kevin and I have a process at the moment we're going through a process at the moment where we're going through every level of capital spending, either predicted or future spending unseen, what can be, if it needs to be moved forward or removed altogether, because there could well be things in there that in reality probably won't happen. So we are going through it line by line, and we'll get that sorted out later, before probably by the end of the summer. But we are going through every capital programme line by line, because there may well be some in there that's been around a number of years, and you go, well, actually in reality we may not be able to get that done. So we are going to do that process. That's ongoing. Council tax. Of course, we would love a better council tax reduction scheme, and it's not something we know. We reduced that offer over the last few years due to financial restraints on the council. We still do offer one of the best council tax reduction schemes in West Yorkshire, if not the best. Could it be better? Absolutely, it could be better. But without some extra money, we can't make it any better than we do. And we prided ourselves on always having the best one in West Yorkshire. As I say, it has reduced, but it's that's the reality of the budget opposition we're sitting. And you're right, hopefully we're going to get a 3-year settlement. All the noises are definitely we're going to get a 3-year settlement. But having said that, the overall package from government looks like it might not be as much as we'd expected. But what we are promised, and we will have to wait and see exactly how it works out, that the block grant will remain, so we get that's now gone into our base, and over the period of time between the end now and when the budget's actually produced, we get the financial settlement, whenever it is, usually late December, is that there will be movement amongst budgets through council. So we will see more emphasis placed on deprivation. So we're likely to see an improvement in our financial position. How much that will be, we don't know, but we are optimistic that we will see the government moving that money around from areas where their levels of deprivation are not as great as ours, and moving some of that money into us. Obviously, the Shire councils are going to kick up a fuss about that, but as you well know, there was a certain Prime Minister who stood in the garden party and said we needed to move more money to the Shire. So with the reversal of that policy is now in place, so we will see some more money, and we will see deprivation recognised as an important part of a financial settlement. So we'll see a bit more. Don't know how much, we'll have to wait and see, but we are definitely on the right track as a policy of looking at deprivation as a provider of funding from government.
Rachel, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think the transformation, just to make you aware that Overview Scrutiny Management Committee want to now look at the overarching transformation programme every 6 months, as well as all those individual committees getting updates on the programmes that relate to them. So that's positive in terms of giving you some assurance around transformation. Your point about centre versus management, I agree with you, it's a real challenge, and I think what you find culturally is that if it's too central, it de-skills your management, but if it's too managers, you lack the expertise needed to be able to understand, especially if it's really complex in terms of income and fees and charges and everything. So I'm hoping that a more bespoke approach will get the best out of both worlds and skill both managers, but have the right level of corporate support. But obviously we'll see that in terms of how things improve from a financial culture perspective.
Okay, happy. Any other members wanting to contribute? Right, as you would imagine, there's a couple for me. Firstly, what I'd like to see more of is the by when on some of these things. In terms of the actions, it's not clear whether that, is that going to be done in the next 3 months, a sense of urgency, or could it be 3 years before we see the outcome from some of them? I didn't get a sense of that. On the first slide, one of the comments was that the Section 151 officer felt that there was a collective understanding of the financial position. I don't believe that across the whole council. And as you well know, I've shared plenty of examples with you of actions or things that have happened by officers at various levels which clearly demonstrate they don't have an awareness or an understanding of the financial position of the council. And I know under the cultural refresh, one of them is about living within our means. But I think to make a statement up front that there is a collective understanding of the financial position doesn't sit comfortably with me. It's not based on the evidence I see as a councillor on a day-to-day basis in dealing with officers at various levels right the way across the organisation. The one I'd love to see action on more quickly is the HR piece about matching structures to budgets. That's got to be urgent, but I've got no sense of is there a timeline around that, or is it, it's just going to happen when we get round to it kind of thing? Because until you've got that in place, we really don't have a firm understanding of actually the budgets in each of the areas and how that relates to the staff in those areas. Rather than picking up everything on here, your point about income from grants and top slicing, I think there's another element to this that is missed often, is what are the future costs as a result of whatever it is you're doing, and particularly maintenance. And I bang on about maintenance continually. We like building these bright, shiny new things, but we never look after them because we never put any budget in to maintain them. And that ought to be, in every single case. And that maintenance budget needs to be adequate. I use the example of the A62 Leeds Road Stadium to station, where we spent all of that money improving the roads. As part of that project, there was a maintenance contract put in place. This is where everybody walks from the station down to the football, Huddersfield Town, everything, and they put in place to maintain it by litter picking once a month, and doing some gardening once a month. Clearly inadequate, but tick the box that they put in some money for maintenance. So these are the sort of things for me that demonstrate to me that the culture isn't everybody. They don't understand the consequences of the actions or the lack of actions very often. It's not just about managing in your budget. It's about making sure that you understand the consequences of the costs and the things that happen. The other thing, I think, and you kind of picked up on it in response to, I can't remember, I think it might be Chris's question. We need to get better at how we communicate this. And for me, I'd like to see something, something around how do we highlight and reward good practice? So what, you know, we've got the high five, can't say that, high five scheme, struggle with that, which clearly is one way, but also, and you know, you and I have talked about this a number of times, Rachel, about sharing stories and examples to help people understand. But, you know, where somebody has saved a budget, reduced a budget, because of they've taken a sensible action, we should reward them in some way, like high five or something, or you could be even more ambitious and give it a bit of money. But, because that would encourage a lot of suggestions, but also about sharing those stories so everybody else understands how they can help. Because at the end of the day, if we're struggling with our budgets, we're not delivering the quality and the quantity of services that we want to provide to our residents. And that's the real reason why we're doing it. It's not because we want to do, actually, close your ears now, Gareth, it's not because we want to do really good financial management. It's actually we want to deliver on behalf of the residents. But I'll leave it at that. I don't really want to say anything.
Just really, I mean, just to thank the committee for the feedback, and the reason there was no timescales is this was more of a, you know, evidence gathering phase, and obviously Councillor Turner will be pushing us to get detailed timelines against this action plan now, but it was to whether the committee, through their experience, had anything to add. So I've written down quite a lot of things, so that's really helpful to inform this piece of work going forward, so thank you.
Much as you may hate me for saying this, it would be nice then perhaps if we can schedule later in the year for you to come back and present that more detailed report with the dates attached to it. We'll add that to the tracker. Yeah, I think we'd want to see that as a committee. Thank you. Are we all comfortable with that, and we just need to note that update? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 10, which is review of procurement practices. Just want to stay at the outset on this, because obviously we've got members present that want to speak, which I will let you do. Today we're not here to debate the issues that sit behind the motion. So if anybody does start drifting into that, I will sort of pull you up as chair. We're here as a committee, our remit as a committee is to look at the asks by the council of officers, to look at the report that's been provided and to assure ourselves, whether we are assured or not, about the actions that have been taken by the council and provide any feedback on that. But I'm going to ask Ruth. I mean, Rachel can do it if she wants. Ask Ruth to present the report. Okay.
Thank you. So I'm Ruth Calladine. I'm the Head of Procurement at the Council. So as outlined in the report, the motion was passed by Council on the 13th of November that requested that the Council undertook a review of its procurement practices. So in the report, I've outlined the stages of the review, which the review was concluded that the Council currently has no contracts in place or recent expenditure for the supply of goods and consumables with companies directly or indirectly involved in the Gaza conflict. The examination of relevant procurement legislation has confirmed that it would be currently unlawful for the Council to adopt blanket policies that intentionally exclude companies based on their involvement in specific geopolitical matters. But going forward, the procurement team will stay vigilant for updates to legislation to ensure that any new legislation or guidance that's issued is implemented at pace. And we'll also consider the debarment list and application of the discretionary exclusion grounds as new procurements are undertaken.
Okay. Thank you. I know we've got some colleagues here who may well want to speak, but I'm going to open it to members of the committee first for any questions or comments.
Thanks very much for treading a tightrope on this one. Well, except it's not a tightrope because in a sense, because the legislation means that council procurement policies cannot pick and choose. That would be illegal, and there would be a cost to paying, a price to pay for doing a procurement that was not within the confines of the new Procurement Act of 23. So that's on the one side of it, and then of course, and you've quite rightly said that the council doesn't have any contracts with that were the subject of the motion to cancel. What we have here is a on the one hand, a genuine and sincere and understandable wish to ensure that the council doesn't procure from a country which is imposing its presence in a very violent way on the people of Gaza. And I have very strong views about that, but that is, you know, that is wrong, and that the impact of the war on the people of Gaza is absolutely appalling. So, but on the other hand, as a council, we have to obey the law. And we don't like the law, so what we have to do is try and change the law through the proper processes. So that's where I am, and so I agree with the report. And I'm sure we can find ways as a council to make sure that suppliers that as you quoting illegally occupying Palestinian territories are not used. I'm sure we can from the way procurement is, but we have to keep within the law.
Thanks, Kath. No comment really needed on that. Chris, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll try and phrase this sensitively. So I think there were two asks in the resolution. One was about not using Israeli companies, I paraphrase, and one was about avoiding using companies directly or indirectly involved in the conflict. I can see in the report we've got a very explicit statement about the non-use of Israeli companies. That's clear. I'm happy to accept that. I'm less clear about the second bit of the motion, if I'm frank, about goods and consumables sourced from companies directly or indirectly involved in the conflict. I mean, that's such a broad scope, it's almost impossible to answer, but that's a different question. I'm just not sure. So I want some assurance that we've actually done that second bit. Notwithstanding that, the report is very clear around the legality. It was helpful, the resolution said about being lawful and practical. So I'm happy to accept the report as it is. I think it's clarified the legal position to such an extent that you know, the matter's resolved from my perspective as an audit committee member. But I would just like some clarity on whether we've done both bits of that resolution or just one bit, because I'm not exactly sure.
Ruth, do you want to?
So the first stage of the review, we gathered information from various sources around the suppliers that have been linked to the conflict. So we looked at the UN database of business enterprises in relation to the illegally occupied territory and other sites suggested by Councillor Saftar, which included the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and the Ethical Consumer.
Thank you.
Apologies, John, I might go on a bit of a tangent. I'll try to keep things calm. But yeah, I've noticed there's government-issued PPNs. There's one PPN 01.22 regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this has been updated. What I'm disappointed about, and I do sympathise that it's a difficult job, I'm disappointed that that the legislation may have been interpreted in a very strict way. I think I'm disappointed. My residents are left disheartened. This damages confidence in the system because that term "will of the people" keeps speaking up, whether it's national referendums, whether it's motions. So potentially hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of northern residents, let's say tens of thousands of our residents here in Kirklees agree wholeheartedly with this motion. And I was told when many of my colleagues were out collecting signatures to back up this motion, and we very welcome cross-party and cross-group support for this motion. When the motion was passed, a lot of our residents, they were given a bit more, they were reinstilled confidence in the system. Now, look, our councillors are speaking on our behalf. Now, Kirklees may only be one authority, but it's a very important authority, and it's an organisation that spends hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. So it's not like a little backwater little parish council. It's an important organisation, and a lot of our residents are mosques, people from the PSC, people from different backgrounds, people from Jewish, Christian, Muslim communities, felt encouraged that their councillors were on the streets, outside places of worship, collecting signatures. But now we feel a bit disappointed. I'm not having to go to the officers in question, not at all. I know it's difficult, but it seems like councils are not allowed to have an ethical procurement policy. That's the concerning thing. Now, I've been talking to Councillor Cooper, Councillor Arshad, and many other colleagues about this, but a lot of our campaigners are left disappointed as well. So the government found a way to put restrictions on certain Israeli ministers recently. Okay, so is there no way we can lobby central government to try to push the envelope to look at corporations like, for example, Dell Computers and Hewlett-Packard Computers are indirectly linked to the occupation of places like Bethlehem, the Holy Land, which affect people of all backgrounds.
I did say at the beginning, restrict ourselves to actually the ask of the motion, and are we as a committee able to reassure ourselves that the actions taken by officers match the ask of the motion. I fully understand how passionate you and many other people feel about this, and I agree with you that you may want to lobby the government to change policy.
Yeah.
But we don't want a speech in this committee about that. Save that for elsewhere and other places where you are able to have that influence. I'm conscious, this is about, are we satisfied as a committee that the officers have responded correctly and appropriately to the ask in the motion? If you can restrict yourself to that, please. I understand how passionate you and many other people feel about this, but in this committee, we have a very tight remit, and we have to stick to that, please.
So, the motion was very clear. It said in the motion that we to ensure that goods and consumables sourced from companies directly or indirectly involved in the Gaza conflict were not used. So, when I agree with my colleagues raised that we've got Dell computers and HP printers within the council. So, I have to ask the question, and Dell is complicit and in the occupation of the Holy Land, Palestine and Gaza. So I have to ask the question, did we look at every contract, did we look at every supplier in depth before we made this decision? And again, I've got to ask this question, were the officers leaned on, were they given guidance regarding interpretation?
Hold on a second. No, sorry, I'll have one chairman of this meeting. You're not allowed to make accusations like that, Councillor Safdar.
I'm just saying, were they?
No.
I'm not saying they were.
I'm not going to accept that because it's inferring something, and I will ask you to leave if you start to make accusations or infer accusations like that. Stick strictly to the evidence. So if you're making a point about Dell or I can't remember what the other one was. HP.
Yeah.
Make your point, and I'll ask for a response to it. Yeah. But restrict yourself to that. Okay,
so there's information available online from whoprofits.org as well as BDS Movement about the links to these corporations with the Israeli security services in the oppression and repression of people, innocent civilians within Palestine, and other countries as well. So did the officers effectively look at those corporations' links?
So what you're saying is there are some websites set up by activists that are making comments about various companies. We have to operate within the law. We can't take on board the views of individuals. So I will ask the officers to respond whether we had ensured that we had checked all of our contracts to ensure that we were operating completely within the law about what we can and can't do. And if you're happy to answer that, Ruth.
Yes, from the websites that I previously mentioned, we did identify Dell and HP. So when we checked the contract register, we don't have any contracts with Dell. And we also checked expenditure from when the motion went to council. To council. And there's been no expenditures between that period and the time that the review was undertaken. The council doesn't have any printers from HP. I checked with the head of IT yesterday. We have Canon and Kyocera. And in terms of Dell equipment, it's legacy kit. We now supply Lenovo laptops.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Did you have any other comments to make? That's it. Right, can you switch your mic off?
Thank you, Chair. So mine's a statement, and on the end of it, there will be a question. So I'll make it as brief as possible. So thank you, Chair. Thank you, members, for allowing me to speak today. I'm here to raise serious concerns about item 10, which I believe is not appropriate to be at this committee and for it to consider it in its current form. Let's recall the origin of this item. On the 13th of November 2024, full council passed a motion on Gaza and ethical procurement. That motion clearly directed Cabinet to act. The expectation was that Cabinet would lead a response, take political ownership and provide direction on how the council would address suppliers, links of all illegal occupation on Palestinian land. Instead, we have a report today, a 7-page report, with no named Cabinet member, no portfolio lead, no Cabinet decision and no plan for Cabinet to consider or implement the next steps. At the Cabinet meeting on the 10th of June, Councillor Patterson was asked directly about this. She refused to answer and instead claimed that the decision was one of this committee. That is simply not correct. The committee's role is not to take political decisions that Cabinet would prefer to avoid. This committee exists to provide independent assurance on governance, risk, audit and standards. It's not a political decision or carry out Cabinet's duties. That's not your role. It's a neutral, technical body, not a substitute for political leadership. And to be fair, there are elements in this report that do fall within your remit, and that's an honest appraisal of this. Oversight of the process used and the review of the contracts, that's within your remit. Assurance that the legal advice was sought and followed, the same. Compliance with procurement, legislation and central government absolutely falls within your remit. But what does not fall within your remit of this is responding to the council motion, deciding how to exclude certain suppliers, determining what actions the council should now take, and allowing officers to implement next steps with no political oversight. That's really, really important. So section 7 of the report refers to future actions by the procurement team, yet there is no Cabinet instructions, no political endorsement and no portfolio holders accountable for those next steps. This committee is being used to give an appearance of scrutiny, thus while avoiding the actual political accountability. That is not your role. It should not be allowed to continue. If Cabinet has failed to respond to the motion passed by full council, that failure should be addressed by Cabinet, not hidden behind a neutral committee process. I urge members to ask the obvious questions. Why hasn't Cabinet taken responsibility for this politically sensitive issue? And why is this committee being asked to do their work? This is not just about governance flaw. It's about deliberate evasion of accountability. What I am asking today, and my question is, will you defer this item and refer it back to Cabinet where it should be politically debated? Thank you.
I'm going to come in first. I'm going to read to you, Councillor Scott, the actual motion. It's numbers 3 and 4. That we ask that Kirklees Council, doesn't say Cabinet. But they are. And excuse me, I'm speaking. We ask that Kirklees Council, where at all legal and lawful and practical, to avoid purchase of goods from Israeli companies illegally occupying the aforementioned Palestine territories. That is about procurement. The assessment, the review of procurement is within the terms of reference of this committee. It is not a political issue, procurement. And number 4 says that this council, again it says council, not cabinet, this council commits to conducting a thorough review of its procurement practices to ensure that goods and consumables sourced from companies directly or indirectly involved in the conflict are not used. Again, it is asking the council to look at its procurement practices. We have the responsibility in our terms of reference for responding and looking at procurement. I'm sorry, it may be that the way the motion was worded is wrong because you wanted action by a different group, but all we can do is respond to the way the motion is worded. There is under number 2, you do call on the leader of the council to take some actions, which I'm assuming they've taken. It's irrelevant from my point of view because that's not within in my remit. But items 3 and 4 are within the remit of this committee. You may not like that, it may not be what you intended, but actually, legally, that's the correct position. I'm sorry, Cathy, but we have the duty to respond to items 3 and 4. It's not for Cabinet, I'm afraid. You may respond if you wish.
Thank you, John. I want to be clear. The elements that you've said, I absolutely accept. But the political element of this sensitive issue was reverted to the leader of the council for her to respond. And what's happened is this has been diverted to you, where corporate governance will be questioned over this because this is not your role. So I accept the items that you highlighted. My name wasn't on that motion because we had a separate one and ours falls. So it's nothing to do with that. This is a very passionate issue that's affecting communities and they care greatly about this. What I'm saying is leadership should be taken by the administration to deliver this back. I'm worried that there's no name to this report and the flack will come to this committee on elements that are political that have nothing to do with you, John. But I'll leave it there, thank you.
Yeah, all I would say is in terms of the item that asks the leader of the council to do certain things, you are at liberty to ask the leader of the council whether they've done those things. It's not to come to this committee and ask this committee to ask them. You, as councillors, have the ability to do that already. Yes, I'll bring Councillor Darwin in.
First of all, thanks for allowing me to speak. I'm also here to raise serious concerns about item number 10. I genuinely appreciate the Council's thorough review of procurement practices in response to the Gaza motion of 13th November 2024. However, people are concerned that the legislative constraints cited may not entirely preclude action. Other councils have successfully implemented similar motions, suggesting possible variations in interpretations or approach. The Council's response seems to blend technical compliance with potential excuses. Having conducted a review and found no direct contracts or expenditure with companies involved in the Gaza conflict, the Council cites legislative constraints such as law, Local Government Act 1988 and Procurement Act 2023. That restricts their ability to adopt policies excluding companies based on geopolitical matters. While these laws do impose limitations, it's unclear whether the Council has explored all possible avenues for action. The Council suggests that they can only assess suppliers individually. which might be a genuine limitation, but it also raises questions about the effectiveness of this approach in addressing the concerns raised by the motion. The Council's response to the motions raises people's concerns furthermore about potential double standards in procurement practices, while citing legislative constraints and case-by-case assessment. The Council's approach appears inconsistent with the UK government's response to Russia's actions, where specific guidance and procurement policy notes have been issued. To better understand the Council's stance, people request clarification on the following: how they've considered the approaches taken by other councils, review process and methodology, potential future actions or changes to procurement practices, alignment with international law and human rights standards, any collaborations or guidance from government agencies. Has surveys or questionnaires been sent to suppliers if they have any links with either Russia or Israel? People want to know if the Council was aware of the legal status. Why run the motion through? Why go through the process? People are asking if this was just another time-wasting, money-wasting, emotional exercise. Thank you for listening.
Right. I'll ask officers to come in a moment. You made reference to all the councils. Which councils are we talking about?
Lancaster's being one of them.
I think also a number of councils in Northern Ireland as well.
Can we have one? So I'll go to officers to see if they can respond to that point.
We haven't come across anything that's had a drastic change in procurement policy. Some councils have committed to undertake a review similar to ours. And in terms of government policy, in procurement policy note, in terms of the Israel and Belarusian supply chain as a result of the Ukraine war, the government haven't issued anything to that effect. As soon as, if they made the decision to do that, as they did with the war in Ukraine, we would, of course, look to implement it as soon as possible, but the government haven't done that yet.
Yeah, I think we have already explored that point around what's needed here is a change in government policy, isn't it, to enable you to do anything on the back of that. I mean, you mentioned double standards as well. I wasn't really sure what the double standards you were talking about was.
Double standards in procurement practices while citing legislative constraints and case-by-case assessment. The Council approach appears inconsistent with the UK government's response to where specific guidance and procurement policy notes have been issued.
Right, so in terms of it appearing different to what's happened in Russia, I think the officers have explained that the government have given specific guidance around Russia, but haven't given that similar guidance around anywhere else. So I don't think there's double standards being adopted by the council. The council is acting within the remit that it's able to act. So I just want to make it clear that it's not the council that you're suggesting is operating inconsistently or with double standards. I'm going to bring Councillor Pinnock in, but I'm conscious that Councillor Arshad... No, Councillor Pinnock, it's always members of the committee first.
Look, I particularly have a lot of sympathy with what the views that were expressed in the motion. The difficulty the council has is that it has got to obey the law.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, there are huge consequences of that. You know, we can't pick and choose. And so that's the starting point. The next thing to think about is what else could those of you who feel, well, those of many of us who feel very strongly about what is going on in that part of the Middle East, and want to put pressure on decision makers what could be done. And actually it's not here, really, sadly, I mean, because it's easier if it's here, and the voices are strong here. It's going through the parliamentary political process, really, is the way to do it. And, you know, you could, far be it from me to invite another motion on this issue, but maybe think about a motion to council, because it's the 6 months rule is gone, which may be not just about procurement, but other ways in which the council may want to have its voice heard about, on behalf of people who live here, who feel and have connections in the West Bank and Gaza territories, how you know, so that those strong views can have a proper expression. Now, you know, it's really difficult because people feel very strongly about it, and it's then very frustrating when you can't find a route to making those views known in the right place. But let's, you know, there's a lot of people have a lot of sympathy with what is being said, but we've got to be within the law, find the route that influences those who make those decisions. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Kath. Councillor Safter.
Thank you for the very detailed and very wise speech from both Cathy and Hanifa. And I wholeheartedly agree with my colleague to my right that I think what we need, this is a debate for another place. And there's an incredible amount of pressure put on us as I'd never like to refer myself as a community leader. Maybe you guys are community leaders, but you know we're working class representatives of our communities, and I think it did hit me that we may need another motion. We may need letters to Parliament. We may need our local parliamentarians to propose another motion. I think the motion should be to try to overturn such restrictive government legislation, sending us down difficult avenues to stop councils implementing such important motions. So I think we do need to maybe have motions, not just in this council, but across the north, speed councils across the north, parliamentarians across the north, to lobby the government to allow us to have ethical procurement policies, not just in regards to Russia and Israel, but also regards to other dictatorships and regimes engaged in war crimes. So yes, there are certain corporations that may not be directly linked, may not have boots on the ground, but there are corporations that are profiting from oppression and repression and war crimes. So I think you're right, that's a conversation for a different place.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Councillor Arshad in because he's been patiently waiting.
Thank you, Chair. I nearly started a whole new conspiracy theory as to why I wasn't allowed to speak. Just 2 points, and I want to keep them as business points rather than any sort of emotional points. Directly and indirectly. Indirectly, we are financially entangled with West Yorkshire pension funds. And if I could ask the Council to look into West Yorkshire pension funds, and in their dealings with BAE Systems, RTX, Lockheed Martin, and anybody else. And coming on to the second point, which is the Kirklees position in line with the legislation the government has issued, and I'm going to paraphrase this, the procurement policy notes tagging suppliers linked to Russia and Belarus, the 0122 and PPN 007. Since there are no equivalent PPNs for Israel or companies operating in occupied Palestinian territories, the Council cannot lawfully exclude such companies from procurement processes or apply blanket bans. And I've got a couple of things I'd like for everybody to take into account. PPNs show what's possible, and not what's prohibited. And these two PPNs that are cited are evidence that government can and does issue guidance allowing public sector bodies to take a stand against foreign entities involved in unlawful behaviour. The precedent does not mean councils must remain passive until central government acts. On the contrary, it proves that ethical procurement can be aligned with legality when there is political will. The absence of a PPN does not remove the council's discretionary powers. Nothing in law states that a council must wait for a PPN to assess its own ethical stance. Councils retain discretion under the Procurement Act of 2023, particularly in relation to suppliers whose conduct raises professional misconduct or grave reputational risk under Schedule 7 of the Act. And I think we're looking at grave reputational risk in this instance with Kirklees. The government has not prohibited ethical policies, while Section 17 of the Local Government Act 88, and that's 1988, limits non-commercial considerations. This is being reformed under the Procurement Act of 2023. Importantly, selective justified exclusions are permissible if based on legal findings, for example, International Court of Justice rulings, and public interests, and not simply nationality. Councils can urge government to act, and I guess leader of the council and Kirklees Council, that's where I would come in and say, can we urge government to act? And I believe there was some conversation around that when I first became a councillor. If current legislation doesn't explicitly allow councils to act on concerns about Palestine, it is entirely appropriate for this council to publicly call for the government to issue equivalent PPNs, just as it did for Ukraine. Not doing so creates a double standard and undermines the UK's consistency on international law. The real problem is political convenience and not legal impossibility. What is cited as a legal barrier is more like a lack of political courage. The government acted swiftly with Russia because there was consensus. The same consensus exists in Kirklees on Gaza. We don't need to wait for permission to say our public money should not prop up war crimes. Chair, and I thank you for allowing me to speak.
I'll ask officers to respond, but I just would say that there isn't a consensus in Kirklees, because it is an item that people feel passionately about on both sides. So you can't really say there's a consensus that everybody has the same view. There are people with different. Yeah. The council has formed a view, and there was a decision taken, but you can't infer from that there's a consensus. That's all I'm saying. But I'll ask officers to respond to the specific points.
Hi, my name is Samantha Lawton. I'm the Service Director for Legal, Governance and Commissioning. And I just wanted to pick up a couple of points. So firstly, in the motion, it did ask the leader to write to Keir Starmer. That has been actioned and it was reported back to Council in the January 2025 meeting. So that element of the motion has been addressed. And you're right, Councillor Arshad, it is possible for political parties to be able to write a further motion asking the leader to lobby government to, add another PPM in relation to Israel. That's a possibility for councillors to do.
Councillor Arshad, did you want to come back?
No, I just want to say it at times seems unfair and it at times seems slow, but the response that I've just received now gives us an indication as to what we can continue to do, and we will continue to do so. So we are being fair, and you are being fair as well.
Yeah, Councillor Cooper.
So you mentioned there is no consensus about this issue, and of course you can make that point. Lacking a consensus does not mean that the status quo stands, and that we as a political body can decide how we deal with a lack of consensus as well.
I wasn't disagreeing with you. I was just making the point that there isn't a consensus.
And I was...
The body can make a decisions as
Yeah, and I was explaining how we can respond to a lack of consensus. The thing which niggles with me about this whole debate is the fact that in 2023 the then Conservative government had introduced an Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill, and the purpose of that bill was to deal with exactly this sort of issue, to actually ban local councils and local authorities from banning the use of Israeli goods. That's one of the prime purposes of it, and companies. Now, that bill was never passed. And the question is, if that bill was never passed, why was it necessary in the first place? If all the things you were saying are in place, and therefore, were they just doing the bill for, I don't know, for political purposes as opposed to anything else? But it really begs the question why they were even bothering. Thank you for looking into things like Dell and the things there, and that was reassuring. And you told us that now we're using Canon printers as opposed to HP printers. Thank you. But Canon owns a company called Briefcam. Briefcam's technology includes video synopsis and facial recognition capabilities, and it's used by the Israeli military in its surveillance of Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. So these companies are everywhere. These companies are involved in, their tentacles are everywhere. So I think it's very difficult in many ways to sort of disentangle ourselves from some of those companies that are out there. But I think obviously we should try, but we should demonstrate that we have looked at those companies, and obviously Canon is one. The point about the PPNs and the inconsistency with the treatment in Russia is a good one, and I think it's one that we would want politically to move forward, which is probably one of the reasons why this would have been best taken to Cabinet, so Cabinet could respond in a political manner to a motion which was meant politically. It shouldn't be here. And it's convenient for some people, I know, for this to come here, but it should be dealt with by the Cabinet. It just looks like it's been placed somewhere which is depoliticising a very political motion, and rightfully, and politically rightfully so, because that's what it was about. It was about expressing an opinion of view which is felt by thousands of people across Kirklees.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, the strongly held political views, I think it's fair to say, are being heard and have been heard both within this chamber and in our communities and more broadly. So I don't think the fact that this motion response or this report has come here rather than Cabinet is in any way suggesting that those voices aren't being heard and those opinions aren't being expressed. It's the wording of the motion, items 3 and 4, that have brought this here. Now, we can't change the wording of the motion. That was a decision of council. We just have to respond to it. Our job today as a committee is to consider whether we are satisfied that the actions taken by officers, which are detailed in that report, address numbers 3 and 4 in that motion. And I think we need to just note the outcome of that review. And I'm just going to ask members now, are we content with noting the outcome of that review? I accept that this isn't a closed matter, and quite rightly, as some colleagues have mentioned, that they may well wish to do other things or take things elsewhere. But we're just literally looking at this small element of it. And are the committee content?
No, can I just suggest, Chair, that we do note the report, but also note the concerns that have been expressed. As simple as that.
I think you need to be a little more specific about what concerns you're referring to, because there's been a long discussion.
Yes, there have. The concerns that a technical response has not enabled a technical and political response, and whether or not, because those are the concerns that have been expressed.
I wouldn't accept that personally, on the basis our job is to respond to the words in the motion. If the words in the motion had been, if the motion had been written differently, they would be getting a political response. I think we need to be careful that we don't step beyond our remit, and our remit is a decision was taken by council. It was based on the words of that motion. We can only respond to that. I think everybody in this room is well aware of perhaps that's not what the intention was, but we can't change the intent. So I think we just have to note the review, and it will be to members who aren't happy that that's given them what they wanted to think about what else they may do subsequent to today. And I think we should just leave it at that, because otherwise we're in danger of stepping beyond our role, potentially stepping into the political arena, which isn't the remit of this committee. And there are, as we've discussed, contested views on this. And I think we need to avoid that, because it brings, you know, the role of this committee into a little bit of question. So I'm sorry, I do disagree with you there, Kath.
Thank you, Chair. You've moved the report. We've moved the note of the report. I'll gladly second that to move progress. Okay.
We're now back in session, and I'm going to ask Gareth to present the audit plan.
Afternoon, Chair, and thank you for that, and afternoon, members. So this is our audit plan for the 24-25 financial year. The plan was discussed and agreed with Kevin and his senior team as Section 151 officer. Conscious of time and the fact that this is quite a detailed report, Chair, quite technical, but what I will propose to do is draw out some of the salient points on page 74 or 80 of 208 if you're on the PDF. So that summarises, I guess, the key elements of our work that we plan for 24-25. So firstly, in terms of our accounts audit, we've highlighted on the left there the significant risks of a possible areas of material misstatement. Those 4 bulleted areas are typical of local government audit plans. First one being management overriding controls. That's a significant audit risk across all sectors, Chair, where there's the possibility of management circumventing controls to potentially manipulate the accounts and the financial position. And then the next 3 areas are areas where you've got significant balances on your balance sheet that are susceptible to material movements with slight changes in assumptions by the valuer or by your actuary in terms of your share of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. I should just mention as well, Chair, that we have identified an other risk this year, which is the implementation of IFRS 16, the leasing standard. This is something that's been mooted for a number of years within local government and was consistently deferred, Chair, mainly around the backlog that had built up for a number of authorities over the years, and this was seen as an additional challenge, I guess, for finance teams and external audit teams to implement. Obviously, you as a council have never been part of a backlogged position, and essentially this standard has now come in for the 24-25 financial year. We're aware from discussions with finance colleagues that they have been preparing for this. We discussed it as part of our audit last year. Obviously, it's going to be the first year that it's audited in full, but we thought it right to draw it out separately within this audit plan, Chair, and clearly we'll feed back on that issue and the significant risk issues I've just mentioned, and indeed any key findings from the accounts audit in our ISA 260 report, which we're due to share with management before the end of the calendar year and report to this committee in January. Our materiality is highlighted on the left-hand side as well, Chair. So obviously we don't audit to the penny, we audit to a material level, which is based on a percentage of your gross expenditure of around about 1.5%, which gives a materiality level of just under 18.5 million. What we do as well, in addition to that, Chair, is obviously if there are any adjustments, amendments, errors that we pick up as part of the accounts audit over our trivial reporting level, we will include that in our report as well, and that's just less than £1 million. So any issues basically of around £1 million or more will be captured in our report. There is a slightly different materiality level set for senior officers given the sensitive nature of that particular disclosure note, and that's 20,000 in common with the prior year. So that's the accounts audit, Chair. Obviously, we've already touched on the other aspect to our external audit work, which is the value for money arrangements review. And that work is underway already. It's again going to be led by Jeanette Beale in our VFM team. So Jeanette will lead that in conjunction with myself and Greg. We did identify, as has already been mentioned, 3 significant weaknesses and resulting key recommendations in that review last year, 2 of which related to the financial sustainability theme. So one around the general, I guess, financial position of the council. We've obviously heard already around the historic use of quite significant levels of reserves to balance the books. I know there is a downward trend on that, but that's starting from a position where the council's level of reserves as a percentage of your budget is at the more challenging end of that Metropolitan Council spectrum. Councillor Pinnock made a comment earlier today, Chair, around recommending revisiting our 2 reports from the beginning of February's audit committee, both the ITHS 260 and the VFM report, and I'd certainly encourage that, because there are quite a lot of comments in there around level of reserves, savings requirements, specifically the capital issue around the town centre regeneration, and obviously a lot of opportunities from that, but a lot of risks off the back of that as well. And we did make quite a significant issue of that, I guess, in the ICE 260 report back in February, in terms of the level of potential capital spend on those regeneration areas and the implications of that for from a revenue point of view. And obviously we've debated at length the MRP issue as well that occurred last year. So certainly recommend, you know, revisiting those 2 reports, and clearly we will draw out the findings and issues from those 2 reports last year. We'll do a follow-up of that as part of the 24-25 audit. The second issue on VFM was around the dedicated schools grant deficit position. Again, this is a consistent issue across the country. Your deficit position, you know, did significantly increase in year. It was in excess of what you'd initially signed up to with the Department for Education. So it is a risk area. Obviously, at the moment, the actual hit to your bottom line, if you like, is overridden by the statutory override that's in place on DSG. That is likely to be extended, given that there are a number of councils in this position across the country. However, if it wasn't extended, then you and a lot of other councils would be, you know, significantly financially challenged. So, again, that's another area of focus that we'll be continuing to review. And then, obviously, the social housing regulator findings that were highlighted last year. We're duty bound to look at other independent regulators' findings on our audit clients, and therefore that was drawn out as a third key recommendation area. In terms of logistics, Greg and I and our team did the planning and interim work in March and April. We're in a good place going into the year-end audit. We're expecting draft accounts by 30th of June's statutory date. I had a brief chat with James earlier, and finance colleagues are on track with that. Our audit will commence in July. The aim is to get the bulk of the audit done between July and the end of September, early October. Get the fieldwork finished in full by November. And then, as I say, share both our draft reports with management before the end of the calendar year, before Christmas, with a view that both reports will come to this committee in January 26. The audit fee that's proposed is the scale fee set independently by PSAA. However, just to be open and transparent, there are likely to be an additional level of fee on the IFRS 16 implementation, and obviously we'll keep a dialogue going with Kevin and in due course with this committee in terms of the level of that fee variation in relation to that particular issue. And the final point I'll make, Chair, before pausing for questions, is that we've obviously considered all the ethical standards, and I'm satisfied that we remain objective and independent of the Council, and therefore can give an independent audit opinion early in the new year, ahead of the backstop deadline, which is once again the end of February, Chair. I think the key thing for us is that, you know, we've always had a good level of engagement with the Council in terms of the audit. And Greg and I were new to the audit last year, albeit you've been a more long-standing Grant Thornton client, and, you know, not being in that backstopped position. I know it was mentioned on Rachel's first slide, I think, that the fact that you've had unqualified, clean audit opinions in full on your accounts shouldn't be underestimated, because there are a significant number of local authorities across the country that are not in that position, and getting back to where you are now is quite a long road for those. So, you know, clearly we're not anticipating any issues being drawn into a backstop for now, because you've avoided it for those periods of time prior to that. So I'll pause at that point, Chair, but obviously happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll open it to members.
really, I always like the really comprehensive approach that you give to all the audit report, putting it in a national context as well as, you know, the local issues that you bring out. So thank you very much for that. You've raised all the big risks within the report, you know, and that the ones that facing all organisations, publicly facing organisations of pensions and how you value the land and property. All that is well, and I think well understood, though it's always makes auditing very problematic, I think, knowing how to value those items. So that is great, and thank you for always pulling out issues of affordability within the council's finances, and the VFM Red report is keep going with that, because some of us will keep going asking the questions. So thank you for that. One of the concerns I have that you brought out was about, that I've raised before and actually never got what I would have said was a satisfactory answer, was about Kirklees Stadium Development Limited. And, you know, unfortunately what I've been saying is what you've brought out, that the council is going to can have to write off a considerable amount of money as a consequence of what's the well, a combination of factors, but one of which is lack of effective oversight on the council's behalf, in my view. That's my view of how we got there. It's not the only factor, but it is a factor. So I will probably pursue that one elsewhere, but thank you for drawing to our attention. The positive thing is that this council has always fulfilled its audit requirements and is among 20%, is it? It's something like that of councils who...
Just to emphasise, I think for the first year that the backstop provision was brought in, we as a firm managed to sign off 83% of our client base in full. So, and we as a firm, I suppose, would argue that the 17% that we had to backstop were the ones that were particularly challenged. The rest of the sector combined, only 30% were signed off in full, and to be fair, that was nearly all one other firm that did the majority of their bit of the market. What that means is that under the new contract that kicked in last year, we inherited a number of organisations, some of which that had never had an audit opinion in any of the 5 years of the original contract. There were a couple down south that had never seen their external auditor since 15-16.
It's, yeah.
So the sector is still, you know, it's still in a mess, albeit a different mess than where it was before the backstop came in. The mess now is trying to regain full assurance. We don't have 1,000 sets of accounts that are unaudited like we did probably this time last year.
Yes. Yeah.
But the different challenge now is getting a sizable majority of the sector as a whole back to full levels of assurance, and that's difficult, Councillor Pinnock, because at the minute there's not a coordinated agreement from the various audit firms, regulators, SIPFA, MHCLG, how you get assurance over certain organisations that haven't had an opinion for so long on their level of reserves, because frankly there could have been anything going in and out of those for that time. And I think what will probably happen, or what will have to happen, if we are ever going to get back to a system of full assurance, is there's going to have to be a decision taken that whatever was sat there before X date, we just run with and we accept.
Draw the line, won't you?
And draw the line, and we focus on everything from that point forward. But that's where I think everybody knows we're going to end up. But there's no consensus amongst the various sort of stakeholders to agree that position, Councillor Pinnock.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I know we've sort of veered off the council sort of approach, but it is, you know, because I'm often very critical of what goes on. But on this issue, that we've always signed off and had full assurance on our accounts by the external auditor, and that's something we ought to be proud of. And so the team and the auditors ought to take credit for that.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with you, Kath. And it shows that the financial challenges we've had over the last few years isn't as a result of poor financial management by the core accounts team, because they've been on top of their job. The problems sat elsewhere, and it plays to the discussion earlier about culture, doesn't it? Did anyone else have any comments on this item? Or are we happy to note Gareth's update?
We ought to get every councillor to read it, because you understand what's going on when. From February. Sorry? And the two from February. That's a really good point, Councillor. Yeah, no, seriously, because then people would understand the financial difficulties the council's in. And anyway.
I think it's not just councillors either, is it? It's officers as well as councillors.
Perhaps so. But anyway.
Gareth, thank you. Yeah, you escape. I know you've got a fair bit to do today, haven't you? His head's all in NHS at the minute. Our next agenda item is the draft annual governance statement. Oh, sorry, I've skipped one. The internal audit annual. Sorry, Martin. The internal audit annual report. So, Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, they're all mine anyway. So, hello, I'm Martin Donnelly. I think everyone who actually here now knows me anyway, so I don't really need to do the reintroduction. But I'm the head of internal audit. So, the law requires, or audit regulations require, that I give the council a annual statement that I'm about the extent to which I'm satisfied with the council's arrangements for governance, risk management and internal control in the organisation to help you reach the same conclusion or otherwise. So what I've shared with you is my annual report that basically says what internal audit got up to during 24-25, what our constraints and issues are, and how the council performed against the work that my team progressed. And we got to the organisation to an assurance level of about 70%, which I think is probably reasonable and consistent with where we've been for a very long time when you adjust the way in which we changed our practice of auditing schools a couple of years ago. So it went in the years when we stopped doing all schools and started concentrating on those with deficits, the percentage of compliance or satisfaction went down fairly significantly, and then last year it was a little better, and then this year a little better again. So I think this is probably consistent with a long-term trend, because schools were previously getting, a large number of schools which were getting good marks for good compliance, but we weren't then adjusting for their budget performance, which in schools in any event has declined somewhat. So the 70% is quite a good outcome, I think. And then making reference to some of the things that were mentioned before about follow-up on recommendations, we have improved the standard of that, which would mean that perhaps hopefully things like the district audit issues wouldn't get out of hand in the way that they were in some previous years. So to cut to the chase particularly, I'm happy to give you an opinion that we do have adequate arrangements, subject to you being aware of the caveats that I put in the report. My report also includes issues around how the audit team needs to change its practice in order to comply with the global internal audit standards, which became effective from the 1st of April 2025. Those are relatively minor, it's true to say, and they're really about our engagement with yourselves and with the clients rather than the work that is performed by the audit team. And then a little bit of information also about how I spend my time, because I know that from time to time there are concerns about the fact that I do not spend all my time doing pure internal audit work. So, safe for that, happy to just take questions, Chair.
Thanks, Martin. I'll open it to members. Andy, if you want to come in first.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, just a question around continuous improvement, really. So, on page 128, it's 4.2. It talks about the questionnaires that you send out, your customer satisfaction questionnaires. Yeah. It said that we didn't get sufficient responses to ascertain performance in that area. So I was just wondering what the background to that was, and actually if there's anything that we can do as a committee to encourage people to respond.
A very valid question. I think this is a continuing problem. What we send these surveys out, but we don't necessarily get them back. Is the blunt answer. We were getting schools that tended to be better than the council in general at sending responses back, and then it's probably fair to say that because of that lack of response, that we as management have not been as hard on telling the audit staff to chase these. So, you know, we probably can make an improvement to try to get more of them back next year. We have tried other alternative approaches, like going to have conversations with executive directors and service directors to get more assurance about how our audit work is being performed. That having been said, sometimes executive directors are not the right people to ask because they don't actually see many routine internal audit reports. They're often seen by heads of service. So, yeah, I think it's absolutely an area we need to put more effort into. So I think that's a very valid comment, yes.
Thanks, Martin. I think we're going to capture that on the, just for Andy's information, we have a tracker where we track issues that are standing from this committee. I think we'll capture that on that so we can come back to it and check that we have made some progress on that. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, for the report and the succinct summary. I was just a bit worried about, well, not worried, I'll ask you a different way. Are you satisfied 66% of the work's been done, so 34% either not done or work in progress, and a 30% negative assurance rate? Just talk me through how you reach your overall conclusion from those data sets. And secondly, and specifically, 38% of financial controls audits are a negative assurance. We've had a long and detailed presentation on a whole raft of things that are being done to improve financial controls. We've had 3 years of red value for money audits. So the specific of how you reach assurance on financial controls, because all the evidence I see would say actually it's not quite that clear-cut.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely hard to say what is and isn't right. We've got very small samples now, and that's part of the issue. The second is that you can get a less than full opinion, i.e. inadequate, for an element of activity that is unacceptable. So you might have the whole of a payroll system may be good, but if there's one area that's weak, that will mean you don't get the adequate, you don't get adequate assurance, you get limited assurance. So those type of things can create a position whereby sometimes we are giving a negative opinion based on not the whole but a part. The issue about the number of unsatisfactories, I suppose to take into account the mix of various different types of audit, and like I say, we tended to rather more dismiss school audits as not being as important in reaching the overall credibility of the organisation issue. There is also the advice about, and this is absolutely not written down anywhere, but I've talked to other audit colleagues across the country who take the view that as long as the organisation is getting a sort of 50% assurance across its broad areas, that it probably means you can give a positive audit opinion. So, yeah, that's giving you a sort of sign about how you can be quite a long way from perfect and still be getting an adequate assurance level. But I think the organisation is aware of what those issues are, and to some extent, us getting better at chasing them up is one of the ways of trying to be sure that as the organisation moves forward, we ought to have less and less of these issues. But, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say everything's lovely, because it ain't.
Did you want to come back, Chris?
I'm not going to come back on the challenge. I just think it's a really important report for the committee, that accepting that conclusion is a significant piece of work. So you've got to be assured that 66% and 30% gives you the assurance. I'm happy with Martin's explanation.
Yeah. Did anyone else? Okay, Kath.
On three, oh, sorry. On 3.2, I thought was a very important little paragraph about the core financial systems. There were weaknesses. District heating, we know about debt collection, we've had reference to, and so on. And it does seem to me that if that links with the presentation that we had, and it would be, I don't know whether there's a room for a you know, of that to be the core financial systems to be part of your internal audit again, just to check, because you say, you know, there were weaknesses. Well, there ought not to be. You know, especially not to be when we're short of money.
I've done it as well. Chris couldn't switch mine on. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We ought to be sure that our core financial systems and processes are operating. But you know, the committee is well aware that they don't operate perfectly, and no one can expect perfection. But it's whether we are at a standard that we ought to be, and are we at a standard of continuous improvement. And I guess that's about the priorities of the organisation, really. Yeah, I think there's an issue around, and it's not accountancy, particularly necessarily a lot of this. It's about HD1, and which is the sort of processing departments that look after things like SAP and the like, and also operating colleagues in service areas. But yeah, we probably between all of us need to have a refocus onto that area.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it, that looking across the agenda we've had today, you've got on the one side, as you raised and as Gareth mentioned, we are getting unqualified audits. So the formal accountancy part of everything is working really, really well. But at the same time, we're also picking up the financial culture and the financial understanding and some of the detail. And it is about, you know, sometimes supervisors or team leaders allowing people access they shouldn't allow them and things like that, which talks to the culture about managing finance, which was the piece that Rachel picked up. So that it's almost like that dichotomy, don't we? That at one level we're doing really, really well, and it's exemplary, but then underneath that there is a lot that's left to be desired, isn't it? And I think we need to retain that focus on that and not allow the fact that we are getting the unqualified audits to distract us from the fact that underneath that there's a lot that could be improved, and that improvement journey is really, really important to us, and we will come back to it.
Chair, if I can, yes, I think you're right. We also, I think something what you might want to, or the committee might want to think about, is the issue about how, as members, you perceive things like failings at the lower level of financial credibility or financial security. Gareth, he told you what these materiality levels are. They're in a sort of number that for most people would be an eye-wateringly large amount if that was in their bank account or whatever. One of the things that you perhaps, and one of the purposes of internal audit is also to give members some assurance that the more basic levels of financial process are done to a satisfactory standard. But it's how much emphasis you want to put on that vis-a-vis all the other priorities, I suppose. Because we get most of that right most of the time, but some of it is right, some of it is not right some of the time.
For me, it's not about you being the policeman. It's about being clear about the accountability of the relevant officers that have those accesses. And it's more about that line management responsibilities, really, rather than going, well, we'll always rely on the policeman to come along and check that people are doing things right. Yes, you do need to do that check, but we shouldn't be relying on that. Has anyone any other questions on this agenda item or are we happy to note this and particularly note the Head of Internal Audit's opinion? We content with that?
3 hours into the committee, I'll almost nod anything.
So there's a ploy there to be at the end of the agenda. Move on, Martin, if you want to take us to the end.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Simon's not here. He's gone to somewhere even sunnier than Kirklees, I think, for this week. So, annual governance statement. This is a bit of a placeholder document. We need to have it alongside the accounts, which are going to be published next week in draft form, because the auditors expect to see them all to be given to them, including the annual governance statement. In reality, the annual governance statement that you ultimately sign off is, and the leader and the chief executive and the chief finance officer personally sign off, is not a document that we can absolutely produce until we've seen the auditor's proposals with regard to the sign-off of the accounts when they choose to do that, which, as Gareth has mentioned, is in either November or January. So, yes, we can talk about the content of this report today, but equally, this is a living document that will keep changing, and possibly, I'm not quite sure the members recall, but last year, the draft you saw at this time and the one that finally went into the accounts was fairly fundamentally changed. This time, I think the proposal we're making to change are rather lesser. We think that some of the issues that were seen as core governance statements have now been tamed. We think that some further ones will be under control by the time in 6 months' time when the accounts are sort of approved, which may well lead you to wish to take out one or two more of the content of this statement. So, more than happy to have a debate today, but if you're feeling that we're a bit tired, then either members can send us comments individually, or you can do it collectively. But really, the time to look at this is in November or in January when we read off the accounts.
Thanks, Martin. Members? Right, I think we're going to note the governance statement, and if members do have anything that they pick out from that, if they'd like to pass that to Martin. And obviously when we get the one later in the year, it's obviously something that we'll go through in more detail. Thank you, Martin. I think we're back to you again for the quarterly report, aren't we?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the final one is the quarterly report, which to some extent we probably should have done before we did the annual report. But you've all seen, most of you have seen the three versions of the quarterly report to now. You'd all had a chance to read the quarterly report 4. This lists a further set of work completed in quarter 4. Hopefully everyone's version is that they've had electronically put to them is in a slightly better state than mine, because it's slightly illegible at the back. But if not, it's really an opportunity now for anyone to ask me questions, really. There's a few pieces of work that are listed out in the report, and more than happy to do questions, Chair. What I would say before that is what we also have in here is a recommendations monitoring report, which we committed to start bringing on a more detailed basis. Some of the feedback I get from my colleagues is that now that services are more aware that this is going to happen, they are slightly more responsive back in feeding back or offering views about whether the recommendations should be agreed. So in that sense, that is a really positive step, because it means that instead of just saying, oh, we'll agree to all the recommendations you've made, they are at least thinking that they might get asked whether they've actually done them or not, either by us or by you or both. So that is a really positive progress position. So I don't know, Chair, whether you want to talk about the quarterly report in itself and then the recommendations separately. And then for those new members, just a reminder that there is a tiny little bit in private, but not very much, which we can just do at the end, if you like.
Thanks, Martin. I'll open again to members if they have any questions. Yeah, Andy, come on in.
Well, it was just to note really that there were a couple of areas, adults and health and children's and families, where it looked as though they weren't actually progressing or achieving the completion of actions within the time frame. So again, I think it's quite helpful to have that data and then, to see what we can do to help to speed that up.
So I'll let Martin come in a second, but what we tend to do is if we get one that's sticking like that, we have the ability, and we do exercise it, to ask the relevant responsible officer to come and explain themselves in the nicest possible way. That does tend to speed things up a little bit, doesn't it, Martin?
Sometimes.
I don't know whether you want to comment specifically on the two that Andy... Right.
I was just thinking of when I last saw a report that referred to disproportionate data sharing, because in most public sector organisations the challenge is not enough data sharing takes place that leads to all sorts of challenges and poor outcomes. So I don't know really what the Youth Justice Service does, but can you just give examples of disproportionate data sharing?
I think it's... I'm just trying to remember what the detail is, Chair. It's around about... Sorry, just... Yeah, that was what got them the poor, the rather more negative outcome, isn't it? Let me just remind myself.
Whilst Martin's looking, I think it's just a really important message going back to culture. Every time there's a serious case review or a serious incident, one of the outcomes is insufficient data sharing between organisations, every single one. So I suppose culturally sending a message that we might be sharing too much has got some risk attached to it. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong, because I don't know the detail, and if you can't find it, it doesn't matter. But I think it's just something to be cautious about the message that sends.
Yeah, I think it... Sorry, Chair, I think that it's about... I'm just reminding myself, having reread this. Yes, I think it's largely around about sharing data without the complete consent or appropriate consent of parents, as it sort of says there. So I think it's around that juxtaposition between what they should and shouldn't be sharing in certain circumstances. But if you think it's an area we need to explore a little further, happy to do so.
I just think someone needs to understand the context, and the safety of children comes before data sharing always. So it's just making sure the message is right. And I don't know.
Yes. No, fair point. Yep.
Okay. There was one from me in terms of the waste contract. It kind of suggested that we should have signed the extension. So the extension started from April, and the report says that it was noted that the 3-year extension hadn't been signed yet, and it wasn't reflected in the risk register. Now that kind of worried me, and I'm just wondering whether we've got an update, because April's like 2 months ago.
Yes. So, Chair, I'm assured that the contract has now been signed.
Okay, thank you. Right. Do we need to do the agenda plan first before we move into... Oh, so firstly, we're just going to note the report, if everybody's happy with that. Okay.
So do the agenda plan.
We'll quickly do the agenda plan. This is just for information, really, and it is subject to potentially changing as things move. But it's just to give you an indication of what's coming to our next committee meetings through the year.
I can agree.
And we happy with that as a draft agenda plan for the year? I mean, if you want to reflect on it and come back to me later, if there's something you think, well, actually, I'd prefer to see that earlier, or it would make more sense to me that was aligned with this other report, please feel free to do so. Presumably we don't have a meeting in October. We possibly don't have a meeting. We mustn't have a meeting. Is it just the dates of the actual meetings?
Yeah, on that, it's the dates of the actual meetings. If there's no date, there's no meeting. No.
No. Right. I'm going to leave that as is. Please come. Go on, Kat.
The only issue that may be worth thinking about is an audit into the KSDL, since it's been raised by the external auditor.
So that would be something that we're asking Martin as in terms of internal audit to look at. This is the agenda plan for our meetings. But I think he'll be happy to pick up and go away and look at it.
There's a sort of conflicted bit for me because I do corporate advice on that project as well. So whether you would be happy for me to do that work, that's one of the it's one of the things that's listed in the things where I do other projects.
I suspect we're not saying about who does it.
Yeah.
We're saying it's perhaps something that needs to be done.
Yeah, I could get one of my team to do it and then report that to you independently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We shall.
I'd ask you to go and look at the viability of doing that and maybe feedback to us at our next meeting.
Thank you, Chair.
That's the way to deal with that, isn't it?